Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the slow, smoky rhythm of a medieval village, a place so far off the King's Road it might as well be invisible. You're walking along a narrow dirt path, hemmed in by low stone walls crumbling under moss and time. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows like it's auditioning for the role of loudest alarm clock before coffee existed. You probably wouldn't survive this. Actually, you definitely wouldn't. But that's okay, because tonight, you don't have to. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere far from medieval mud, post your location and local time in the comments so I can picture exactly where in the world you're hearing this. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your village isn't on any map, and that's the way everyone likes it. The nearest castle is 2 days' walk, the nearest market even farther. The land rolls out in uneven swells of pasture and scrub, stitched together by hedgerows and stubborn oaks that have been here longer than the oldest grandmother's memory. At night, it's just you, the dark, and the wind sneaking under the door. There's a freedom in this invisibility. You and your neighbors don't pay much attention to the royal decrees drifting in from some distant hall. They're like rumors of a storm you'll never actually see. Here, survival is a quiet art. You rise with the light, or with the clanging of the communal church bell if someone decides to ring it. You tend your plot of land, if you're lucky enough to have one, and watch the seasons turn your efforts into food, or sometimes into nothing at all. The pace is slow, but there's a constant undercurrent of work. Mending, sewing, fetching water, patching roofs, shooing chickens away from the cabbage. And yet, because the village is so small, everything you do is woven into a web of shared labor and shared history. The homes are nothing you'd find on a royal tour. Imagine low, squat huts of wattle and daub, wooden frames filled with a thick, sticky mash of clay, straw, and dung. Inside, the floor is packed dirt, strewn with rushes or straw that you change just often enough to keep it from turning into a biology experiment. Smoke curls upward from the hearth in the center, searching for the hole in the roof. Some days it finds it, other days the room just fills until your eyes water and your clothes smell like a bonfire for the rest of the week. But the warmth it brings is worth the cough. There's one door, maybe one small window shuttered with a wooden plank, and a single room where everyone sleeps, eats, and talks. Privacy is a concept you've heard of, like dragons. Interesting. But you're not sure if it really exists. The loft above the main room holds straw mattresses for sleeping, though mattress is a generous term. At night, you curl under a rough wool blanket with your family, listening to the wind and the occasional bark of a dog outside. Out in the yard, if you can call the trampled patch of mud a yard, you've got a pig or two, some chickens, maybe a goat. They're not just animals. They're a form of insurance, an investment in survival. Lose them, and you've lost more than dinner. You've lost the possibility of trade, of manure for your crops, of milk for your children. Historians still argue whether such isolated villages traded more or less than we assume. But the truth is, the animals are currency that never clinks in a pouch. And yet, for all its roughness, there's a rhythm here that's oddly comforting. Every day has its tasks, every season its rituals. Winter means conserving firewood, patching clothes, and spinning wool by the hearth. Spring is for planting and praying the frost stays away. Summer is work from dawn to dusk, but the light lingers and the fields hum with insects. Autumn is the season of gathering and storing, of hoping the food you've set aside will last until the first shoots of green return. You might think this isolation is lonely, but here, loneliness is rare. Your neighbors are not just people who live nearby. They're your safety net. If your roof caves in during a storm, they'll help patch it. If you're too sick to tend your goat, someone will milk it for you. You return the favor, not because it's polite, but because it's how everyone survives. Outsiders might call it communal living. You just call it life. And sometimes, the outside world does intrude. A wandering peddler might trudge into the village with ribbons, salt, or a scrap of news from the next shire. You listen, curious but cautious. Stories from beyond the hedgerows are like watching a far-off fire. You're drawn to them, but getting too close can burn. The last time someone from your village wandered too far, they came back with a cough that took half the family before winter was done. The beauty of being hidden is that trouble often passes you by. No royal tax collectors tramping down the lane. No marching armies flattening your wheat. But the flip side is, when trouble does arrive, be it a sickness, a failed harvest, or a flood, there's no one coming to save you. You and your neighbors become your own lords, your own guards, your own healers. You can't outrun disaster here. You can only meet it with the stubbornness that's been passed down like a family heirloom. By now, you've probably realized that in a village like this, the line between survival and ruin is thin enough to trip over. But that's the strange magic of it. Every day you live here, you learn exactly how much you can endure. And in this little patch of earth, tucked away from kings and wars, that endurance is worth more than gold. If you were born here, you probably won't ever leave. Not because you wouldn't want to see the great cities or the sea you've only heard about in stories, but because travel is expensive, dangerous, and, let's be honest, pointless for someone whose life revolves around this scrap of land. Most people, have never been more than a day's walk from their front door. And the few who have, well, they tend to talk about it so much that you start wondering if the trip was worth more as a story than as an actual experience. The boundaries of your world aren't marked by maps, but by lived experience. The farthest hill you've seen is the one where the shepherd grazes his flock in the summer. The darkest place, is the small patch of forest where you collect firewood and try not to think about the stories of wolves and spirits. The most foreign sound you've ever heard is the metallic ring of a peddler's cart coming down the lane with pots and pans that gleam like small suns. Inside your home, the hearth is the beating heart of daily life. It's where you cook everything from thick vegetable pottages to bread baked on flat stones. And it's where you sit during the long winter nights, telling stories or listening to the older folks spin tales that stretch back generations. These aren't just entertainment. They're teaching tools, warnings, and memory rolled into one. The story about the boy who wandered too far into the forest and never came back? That's less a ghost story and more a reminder that straying off familiar paths can be a death sentence. Your diet is, let's call it, functional. Bread is the cornerstone, heavy and coarse, made from whatever grain you can grow or barter for. Rye if you're inland, barley if you're near the coast, oats if you're unlucky. You thicken soups with beans, peas, or lentils, and if you're especially fortunate, you'll have onions, leeks, or cabbage to toss in. Meat is a luxury often reserved for feast days or after an animal has grown too old to be useful for anything else. Even then, you eat nose to tail. Nothing goes to waste when resources are this thin. And while water from the village well is your main drink, ale is safer and more satisfying. It's not strong enough to make you drunk unless you try very hard, but it's full of calories and free from the bacteria that can turn a drink of cold water into a week of stomach misery. Children drink it, too, because there's no such thing as kid-friendly beverages. Everything is survival-friendly, or it's useless. Seasonality dictates your schedule more than any clock or calendar. The church might mark the year with feast days and saint celebrations, but for you, the real calendar is made of frost dates, harvest times, and the stretch of days when the sun doesn't seem to set until well past the evening chores. Summer feels endless when you're working in the fields from dawn until you can't see the hoe in your hand. But by the time autumn arrives, you're already worrying about how much firewood you've stacked and whether the grain stores will hold out. Community life revolves around cooperation and unspoken agreements. If someone's barn burns down, neighbors help rebuild it, not because of any legal obligation, but because next time it could be yours. Thatched roofs leak, oxen go lame, and children fall sick without warning. In a place with no safety net, your safety is the people around you. Even disputes over grazing rights, stolen firewood, or whose pigs ate whose cabbages are usually settled with grumbling compromises, because grudges make bad neighbors and bad neighbors make for dangerous winters. The church, small and plain, is both spiritual center and social hub. The priest knows everyone's sins and secrets, though he often keeps more to himself than the gossipers in the alehouse. He reminds you every Sunday that God is watching, but he's also the one who will pray for rain when the fields crack under drought, or lead funerals when sickness steals too many at once. Faith here is less about lofty theology and more about trying to make sense of the daily grind. Why some children live and others don't. Why the weather can undo a year's work in a single storm. Why good people suffer. Of course, life in an isolated village has its own brand of danger. It's not just the wolves or the rare band of outlaws. It's the fact that when disaster strikes, whether that's a failed harvest, a fire, or an outbreak of illness, you have nowhere to turn but inward. A bad year can mean hunger, and hunger means desperation. Some families will quietly leave in search of better fortunes, though whether they find them is anyone's guess. Others will tighten their belts, water down the pottage, and pray for the mercy of a mild winter. But for all its hardships, there's a sense of ownership here that no lord or king can take away. You know, every rut in the lane, every knot in the old oak by the well, every sound your animals make in the night. You've planted trees and seen them bear fruit. You've helped deliver calves and lambs, mended fences, and patched roofs. These small acts, repeated over years, are what survival looks like here. Not grand gestures or battles won, but the quiet, stubborn refusal to give in to the land's indifference. And maybe that's the real secret of life in a hidden medieval village. You don't survive because you conquer the land, but because you learn to live with it, to bend when it bends, and to endure when it doesn't. You measure wealth not in gold, but in full-grain stores and neighbors you can trust. You measure time not in hours, but in harvests and hearth fires. And when you lie down at night, listening to the wind through the thatch, you know that everything you have, meager though it may be, is hard-earned and entirely yours. The rhythm of your year is so predictable you can almost feel it in your bones. Winter is a season of waiting and mending, patching clothes, repairing tools, and spinning wool by the fire. Spring wakes the village with muddy roads, the smell of turned earth, and the back-breaking work of planting. Summer brings heat and flies, but also the reassurance of crops growing high. Autumn is a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the harvest is in, dread that it might not be enough. And through it all, there's the constant whisper of the Lord's demands. Every year, you owe him rent in grain or labor, sometimes both. It might mean spending weeks working his fields instead of your own, or delivering a portion of your harvest to his granary even when you're worried about feeding your family. The bailiff, his steward, or sometimes armed men arrive to collect, and there's no real negotiating. You pay what's asked, or you risk fines, confiscation, or worse. Still, it's not as if the Lord is a distant phantom. His manor might be a day's walk away, and while he rarely visits, his authority is everywhere, on the roads you can't travel without permission, in the mill you must use and pay for, in the forests you're forbidden to hunt unless you want to be accused of poaching. And yet, he's also the one who's supposed to protect you from raiders, settle legal disputes, and keep order. Whether he actually does these things well is another matter entirely. Taxes aren't the only obligations. The church takes its share too, usually a tithe, 1/10 of whatever you produce. You can't exactly hand over 1/10 of a sheep, so sometimes you give wool or other goods in place of the animal. And if there's a holy day approaching, you might be expected to contribute extra to decorate the church or feed guests during the celebrations. In a bad year, these obligations can feel like a second famine, one imposed not by weather but by the people who claim to speak for God or law. Despite this, life is punctuated by moments of joy that make the grind bearable. Feast days are the big ones, public gatherings where the whole village comes together, work stops, and food is shared more generously than usual. The ale flows more freely, music fills the air, and if the weather's warm enough, dancing might spill out into the lanes. Children chase each other in games, older folks swap stories, and for a little while, the hard edges of life soften. Marriage celebrations are another bright spot. They're as much about strengthening community ties as they are about the couple themselves. You might not have the luxury of marrying for love. Family arrangements and dowries play a big part. But there's still genuine affection and excitement in the air. Everyone pitches in, from baking bread to brewing ale, because in a place where every hand matters, new unions are cause for optimism. On quieter days, leisure takes simpler forms. Men might carve wooden tools or play dice. Women might embroider or sing while working, and children turn any open space into a playground. There's no shortage of work to be done, but there's also an unspoken understanding that life can't be all toil. A shared joke at the well, a stolen moment to watch the sunset from the fields. These are the small luxuries that cost nothing and mean everything. The seasons also bring their own risks. In spring, swollen rivers can sweep away livestock or flood the fields. In summer, drought or storms can ruin crops overnight. Autumn might bring early frost, and winter is always a gamble. Too mild and disease can spread. Too harsh and the firewood and food stores might run out. Each year teaches the same lesson. Survival is never guaranteed, and even your best efforts can be undone by forces you can't control. And yet, the people here are not hopeless. Resilience is built into the very fabric of the village. Families teach children to adapt, to make do, to think ahead. You might repair an old cloak instead of making a new one, mix grains to stretch the bread, or share tools to avoid buying more. You know how to store apples and straw to last through winter, how to dry herbs for medicine, and how to spot the signs of coming bad weather. News from outside your tiny world arrives slowly, carried by traveling merchants, wandering priests, or soldiers moving from one posting to another. Most of it feels remote. Wars fought in distant lands, new kings crowned, treaties signed. But sometimes the news is personal. A neighboring village burned in a raid, a market opening 2 days' walk away, or rumors of sickness spreading along the roads. When that happens, the village responds as it always has, by closing ranks, guarding its resources, and hoping to ride out whatever comes next. There's an unspoken truth about life here. Survival is a collective effort. You might tend your own plot, feed your own children, and patch your own clothes, but you are never truly alone. When the thatch on your roof needs replacing, neighbors lend a hand. When someone falls ill, others take over their chores. When a child is born, the whole community feels the joy. When someone dies, the whole community feels the loss. By the time you reach old age, if you're lucky enough to, your life will be measured not in coins or possessions, but in the work you've done and the people who remember you. You'll have watched seasons change dozens of times, felt the same worries and the same small triumphs repeat, year after year. And perhaps that's the strange comfort of it all. Though life is hard, it is also deeply familiar. The hardships are known, the joys are cherished, and the bonds between people are unshakable. So when someone asks how a hidden medieval village survives, through plagues, famine, lords, and the slow grind of years, the answer isn't just in the tools or the harvests. It's in the stubborn, quiet agreement among everyone who calls this place home, to endure together for as long as the land allows. The medieval countryside isn't just fields and farms. It's a living system of people, animals, and land bound together by necessity. For peasants, every survival skill is learned young and reinforced daily. You don't get to choose whether you'll learn them. The seasons in your stomach decide for you. The first skill that matters is knowing your soil. Before you ever put a seed into the ground, you've learned to read the earth like a book. Sandy soil drains fast but can starve a crop of water. Clay soil holds moisture but can drown roots in a wet year. Mixed loam, dark, crumbly, and rich, is the dream, though few villages are lucky enough to have it everywhere. Even without modern science, peasants understand how crop rotation keeps the land alive. Wheat or rye one year, peas or beans the next. Then maybe a fallow season where animals graze and manure enriches the earth again. Plowing is another art. Heavy wooden plows, often drawn by oxen, cut deep into the earth, but they're slow and hard to handle. Oxen are sturdy and cheaper to keep than horses, though slower. Wealthier lords might invest in horses for speed, but most peasants make do with what they can afford or what they're allowed to use. The plowman must know how deep to cut, how to avoid stones that could shatter the blade, and how to turn the furrows so rainwater doesn't pool and rot the seeds. Once the fields are ready, planting begins. This is often a communal task, with families working side by side. Seed is precious. Too much scattered and you waste food. Too little and the yield suffers. Planting is done by hand, broadcasting seed in careful sweeps, then lightly covering it with soil. You might use a wooden rake or simply your feet to press it in, praying that rain comes soon but not too hard. Animals are more than food. They're partners in survival. Chickens roam freely, eating insects and scraps, while pigs are often left to forage in the woods, fattening on acorns. Sheep provide wool, milk, and sometimes meat, and their manure is as valuable as their fleece. Cows give milk for butter and cheese. Oxen provide muscle for plowing, and even dogs have their jobs, herding, guarding, or hunting vermin. Every creature has a role, and losing even one can hurt the whole household. Foraging supplements the diet, especially in lean years. Children are often sent to gather wild berries, nuts, mushrooms, and edible greens. Knowledge of what's safe to eat is passed down carefully. Mistakes can be deadly. In autumn, families collect herbs for medicine, dry them in bundles, and store them in clay jars or cloth bags. Elderflowers, yarrow, and mint might be brewed into teas. Garlic is valued both for flavor and for its supposed ability to ward off sickness. Water is life, and securing it is never taken for granted. Some villages are lucky enough to have a clear stream or river nearby, while others rely on wells. Wells are community property, and their maintenance is a shared responsibility. Drawing water is a daily chore, and in winter, breaking through ice is just part of the routine. Peasants understand that dirty water can bring illness, though their explanation might be framed in terms of bad air or curses rather than bacteria. Still, they instinctively avoid drinking from stagnant pools, and they often boil water for soups or stews, which makes it safer. Food storage is a constant concern. Grain is kept in large wooden bins or sealed clay jars, sometimes elevated to keep out rats. Salted meat hangs from beams in the smoky warmth of the hearth. Root vegetables are stored in cool, dark cellars or buried in pits lined with straw. Apples and pears might be stored in hay to keep them fresh longer, while surplus milk is turned into cheese, which lasts much longer than fresh dairy. Firewood is another survival essential. The right kind burns hot and long, oak, if you can get it, while softer woods burn fast and leave more ash. Collecting wood is year-round work. Green wood cut in summer is stacked to dry for winter. In lean times, peasants burn peat or dried animal dung, neither pleasant but both better than freezing. Skill with tools can mean the difference between thriving and barely scraping by. Blacksmiths are rare in small villages, so most repairs are done at home. Men know how to sharpen a sickle, replace the handle on an axe, or patch a hole in a wooden bucket with resin. Women maintain the household spinning wheels, looms, and cooking pots. Tools are never left to rust. Every item is an investment of time and resources that can't be wasted. Even the smallest luxuries have a survival function. Beeswax candles are expensive but give brighter, cleaner light than tallow. Linen clothes last longer than wool, but are rarer because flax takes space and labor to grow. Soap, made from animal fat and lye, is valued not just for personal hygiene but for cleaning tools and dishes. Underlying all of this is the unspoken reality: you can't do it alone. Families rely on each other, and the village relies on cooperation. If your cow dies, you might borrow milk from a neighbor until your calf grows. If someone's roof collapses in a storm, everyone pitches in to rebuild it before the next rain. Skills and tools are shared as much out of necessity as kindness, because someday you'll be the one in need. Peasant survival is not just about food, shelter, or tools. It's about the constant balancing act between using resources now and saving them for later. Spend too much of your grain, and you'll starve before the next harvest. But save too much, and you might weaken from hunger when you need your strength the most. The hardest skill of all is knowing when to take the risk. Illness in the medieval countryside is like an uninvited guest, never predictable, rarely gentle, and often deadly. For peasants, sickness isn't just a personal problem. It's a crisis for the whole household. When one person is down, the workload shifts to everyone else, and in the delicate balance of survival, even a few days lost labor can mean a failed harvest or lost livestock. Medical knowledge is a blend of tradition, superstition, and trial and error. The village healer, sometimes called a wise woman or cunning man, relies on herbs, charms, and remedies learned over generations. Honey might be smeared on wounds for its soothing effect. Onion poultices are used to draw out infection. Willow bark is boiled for pain relief. Some treatments help, others do nothing, and a few make things worse. But without better options, people cling to what they know. When a sickness sweeps through, quarantine is crude but practiced. A family might isolate the ill in a corner of the house, separated by a curtain or a reed mat. In worse cases, huts are built outside the village to keep disease at bay. Smoke from burning herbs, juniper, rosemary, or sage, is thought to cleanse the air, and people may carry small cloth bags of fragrant plants around their necks, inhaling their scent in the belief it will ward off contagion. Injuries are in even more constant danger. A deep cut from a sickle, a broken bone from a fall, or an infection from a splinter can end a life just as surely as plague. Peasants have learned to work with caution, but the tools of survival, axes, plows, knives, are also tools of injury. If you're lucky, a wound is cleaned with wine or vinegar, then bound with clean linen strips. If you're unlucky, infection sets in, and without antibiotics, the outcome is grim. Pregnancy and childbirth are another high-stakes part of survival. Women often give birth at home, assisted by midwives who know dozens of ways to ease labor, though not all are effective. Childbirth can claim the life of mother, child, or both. And it's not unusual for large families to lose multiple children in infancy. This reality fuels the need for many births. Survival of the family's labor force depends on numbers. Beyond illness and injury, nature itself is a constant opponent. Storms flatten crops in an afternoon. Drought shrivels fields over months. Heavy rains can turn rivers into floods that sweep away livestock, stored grain, and even houses. In years when spring frosts kill young shoots or autumn hail shreds wheat heads, famine looms. Without surplus, peasants rely on foraging, slaughtering animals early, or stretching food with bark, acorns, and whatever can be chewed and swallowed. Animals can be both friend and foe, while cows, sheep, and pigs are essential. They're also vulnerable to disease, murrain in cattle, sheep pox, swine fever. A livestock epidemic can cripple a village. The loss of oxen means no plowing, The loss of sheep means no wool for clothing or trade. In bad years, desperate peasants might slaughter breeding animals to survive the winter, only to face scarcity in the spring. Pests take their own toll. Rats raid stored grain. Weevils eat through flour. Lice, fleas, and ticks are an unavoidable part of life. It's not just the annoyance, they carry disease. The connection between vermin and sickness isn't fully understood, but people notice patterns. More pests, more illness. Cats, ferrets, and even small dogs are valued as pest controllers, though superstition sometimes turns against them, especially during times of panic. Winter is the great test. Once the days shorten, work shifts from field labor to maintenance and survival. Fires must be kept burning. Stored food is rationed. Tools are repaired for spring. On stormy nights, people huddle around the hearth, the only source of light and heat, patching clothes, mending nets, or carving wooden spoons. The cold gnaws at fingers and toes, and frostbite is a known but rarely named danger. Those who survive the coldest months often emerge thinner, weaker, but grateful. Religious belief plays a role in endurance. The church isn't just a place of worship. It's a moral anchor and a social hub. In times of sickness or famine, priests might lead processions, bless the fields, or organize communal prayers for rain or sunshine. Holy relics, saints' days, and fasts structure the year, giving hope and order even when life feels chaotic. Faith offers an explanation for suffering, whether as a test, a punishment, or a mystery, and that explanation can be as important as any physical cure. Community resilience is built in small acts. When illness strikes one household, neighbors might deliver bread or fetch water. A widow might receive help harvesting her field. An orphan might be taken in by relatives or even unrelated villagers. These acts aren't purely altruistic. Mutual aid ensures the village as a whole survives, because in the fragile economy of peasant life, the loss of even a few workers can hurt everyone. And yet, despite all this hardship, life is not only struggle. There are moments of joy, feasts after a good harvest, weddings, seasonal festivals with music and dancing. These events aren't just entertainment. They're a reminder of shared identity, a chance to forget the daily grind, and a way to reinforce the bonds that make survival possible. Without these, the spirit would wither even faster than the body. In the end, surviving illness, injury, and nature's cruelty is about constant readiness. Peasants live with the understanding that tomorrow could bring a flood, a fever, or a fall from a ladder. That awareness shapes every decision. Plant extra beans in case the wheat fails. Keep a loaf aside in case someone can't work tomorrow. Save the strongest oxen for the hardest plowing. Caution is the shield. Preparation is the sword. For a medieval peasant, survival isn't just about enduring the present. It's about preparing the next generation to face the same hardships. Children grow up with work woven into their days from the moment they can walk. By the age of 4 or 5, they might scare birds from crops, carry water, or gather firewood. By 10, they're helping in the fields, tending animals, or assisting in household tasks that directly support the family's survival. Learning is practical, immediate, and relentless. A boy learns how to mend a fence by watching his father. A girl learns to spin wool by sitting beside her mother. There's no formal schooling for most. Lessons come in the form of instructions shouted over the wind in the fields, or whispered while kneeling over a pot of stew. And because every pair of hands matters, mistakes are corrected quickly and often sharply. A broken tool or poorly tied bundle can mean lost hours, even lost food. Skills are passed down with a deep sense of continuity. A father might teach his son the exact way to sharpen a scythe, a technique learned from his own father decades earlier. A mother might show her daughter how to judge whether a loaf of bread will keep for days or spoil by tomorrow. These inherited techniques are not simply tradition. They're the difference between having enough and going hungry. Seasonal knowledge is one of the most vital inheritances. Children learn to read the signs of weather, a ring around the moon suggesting rain, the way certain flowers close before a storm. They learn planting rhythms tied not just to the calendar but to the soil's feel underfoot, the smell of the air, the calls of migrating birds. Such observations can't be rushed. They are gathered over years, through repetition and the watchful eyes of elders. Survival training also means preparing for emergencies. In a world without stores or quick rescues, resourcefulness is the safety net. A boy may be shown how to slaughter a chicken humanely and dress it for cooking, not because it's pleasant, but because one day he may need to do it alone. A girl might learn how to improvise a bandage from torn linen or to mash certain leaves into a healing paste. There's no, we'll call someone else. The someone else is you. Children also absorb the unwritten rules of community survival. They see that during a poor harvest, families with a little extra grain still contribute to the communal store. They watch adults trade goods and labor, and they learn when to speak up in disputes and when to hold their tongues. Social survival is as critical as physical. Anger the wrong neighbor, and you may find yourself without help when you need it most. As they grow older, young peasants begin taking on specialized roles. A strong, observant boy might be trusted with guiding the oxen at plowing time, a skill requiring patience and steady hands. A careful, quick-fingered girl might be chosen to mend the village's fishing nets, a task that demands precision. These specializations increase their value to the household and the community, making them indispensable. There is also a silent curriculum of endurance. Children see their elders work through pain, carry loads despite aching joints, and rise at dawn even in freezing weather. Complaining may earn a sympathetic nod, but rarely relief. The message is clear. Hardship is part of life, and meeting it without flinching is a form of strength. But survival isn't all grim determination. Elders also teach the importance of small pleasures, sharing a honeycomb after a successful bee harvest, playing simple games with carved wooden toys, or singing old songs while shelling peas. These moments keep spirits alive, showing the young that joy is not a luxury but a necessity in a hard world. Adaptation is another vital lesson. Medieval life is not static. Weather patterns shift, lords change, new diseases arrive, and old fields may be abandoned for new ones. When a frost destroys a crop, the village might experiment with hardier grains. When a new tax is levied, peasants may find ways to disguise their surplus or switch to less taxable goods. Children watch and learn these quiet forms of resistance and adjustment, understanding that survival means bending without breaking. For many families, marriage is also a survival strategy, and children are taught from an early age to consider alliances carefully. A union with a skilled weaver or a man who owns a plow team can make the difference between scraping by and relative security. Parents negotiate matches with survival in mind, and children grow up knowing that love is not the only factor in such decisions. By the time they reach adulthood, young peasants are seasoned in the rhythms of their world. They can predict the weather well enough to plan a harvest. They can tend to sick animals. They can repair a leaking roof. And they know which neighbors can be relied upon in a crisis. These skills are their armor against famine, disease, and misfortune. Armor no one can take away. And yet, despite all preparation, no generation can shield the next from every blow. Plague may strike, fields may fail, and war may sweep through. What they can pass on is resilience, the muscle memory of survival, and the knowledge that life's uncertainties can be met with the tools in their hands and the strength in their hearts. In this way, the peasant's greatest inheritance is not land, wealth, or even livestock. It's the unbroken chain of know-how and determination that binds one generation to the next, ensuring that, no matter how harsh the world becomes, someone in the village always knows how to keep going. When the plague came, it did not knock politely. It ripped through medieval villages like a wildfire in dry brush. For peasants already accustomed to hunger, cold, and hard labor, this was a different kind of enemy. You couldn't see it coming across the field. You couldn't fight it with a hoe or a pitchfork. It slipped into homes quietly, left bodies cold by morning, and moved on before anyone could make sense of it. The first sign was often fear before illness. Travelers brought news of entire towns emptied, of carts piled high with the dead. Then came the smells, strange, sour odors from the sick. The heavy scent of incense burned in a desperate attempt to purify the air. By the time the symptoms appeared, fever, blackened swellings, coughing blood, it was already too late for most. For a peasant family, the arrival of plague meant instant upheaval. If one person fell ill, the others had to choose between staying to care for them or fleeing to avoid infection. Families sometimes split apart, some running to relatives in the countryside, others staying behind. A household that lost its strongest workers could not tend its crops, and the fields would quickly grow wild. Hunger often followed disease like a shadow. Fear reshaped the village itself. Neighbors who once shared bread now avoided each other. Communal gatherings were abandoned, market days were canceled, and even church services, normally the anchor of weekly life, were suspended or sparsely attended. Priests sometimes refused to administer last rites for fear of catching the sickness. The normal rules of death broke down. In good times, a burial was a careful, communal act with prayers, candles, and mourners. In plague years, the dead were buried quickly, often in mass graves, with little ceremony. There were simply too many bodies and too few healthy hands. Survivors often carried guilt, not because they failed to save the sick. No one could, but because they couldn't honor them as tradition demanded. Yet even in this chaos, peasants adapted. Some turned to old superstitions for protection, carrying herbs like rosemary or sage in pouches, hanging garlic over doors, or burning juniper in the home. Others adopted strange new practices learned from traveling merchants or wandering healers, wearing charms, avoiding certain foods, or bathing in vinegar. None of it worked reliably, but in a time of uncertainty, any action felt better than helplessness. Isolation became a survival tactic. Some families shut themselves inside their homes, living off whatever food they had stored. Others moved into the woods, pitching rough shelters away from the main road. The idea was simple. Avoid contact, avoid death. It worked sometimes, but it also meant risking hunger or attacks from wild animals and bandits. Communities also experimented with quarantine, though the word itself was not yet common. In some villages, strangers were not allowed to enter without waiting days outside the settlement. Goods from outside were left at a distance and only retrieved after the merchant had gone. While such measures slowed the spread, they also cut off trade, making it harder to obtain essential supplies. Plague years upended the feudal hierarchy in subtle but profound ways. Lords, too, were vulnerable to the disease, and some manors found themselves without leadership when their masters died. With so many peasants gone, labor shortages emerged almost immediately. Surviving workers suddenly became more valuable. They could demand better terms, less rent, more freedom, or even wages instead of labor owed. Some took the opportunity to leave entirely, seeking work in other towns or on more generous estates. But in the thick of an outbreak, survival came before bargaining. Villages organized themselves to protect the healthy. Small groups would take turns caring for the sick while others kept the fields from total ruin. Grain stores were guarded against theft, sometimes more fiercely than against wolves. Children were kept indoors, their laughter replaced by a tense silence. Religious interpretation shaped behavior, too. Many believed the plague was God's punishment for sins, whether personal, communal, or societal. This belief fueled acts of penitence, public flagellation, fasting, and long processions when gatherings were still permitted. Others sought scapegoats, leading to violence against outsiders or minority groups accused of bringing the disease. And yet, not every peasant reacted with fear alone. Some saw opportunity amid the horror. Abandoned houses could be claimed, and with fewer mouths to feed, food was sometimes easier to come by after the first devastating wave. Land that once seemed overcrowded now lay open for cultivation. These shifts would have lasting consequences in the years after the plague, altering the balance between lords and laborers. Still, during the height of an outbreak, the reality was stark. Survival often came down to luck. The strongest, healthiest young men could die within days, while an elderly woman might survive without explanation. Families prayed, avoided strangers, and clung to whatever protective measures they could invent. But ultimately, the plague was a test of endurance in the face of an invisible enemy. For the medieval peasant, enduring a plague meant accepting that life could be turned upside down in the space of a week. One day you were hoeing a row of beans. The next, half your village was gone. The survivors carried not just scars of loss, but a sharpened understanding that nothing, not even the ancient rhythms of the land, was guaranteed. This hard lesson would shape how they lived once the sickness passed, influencing everything from how they worked the fields to how they negotiated with their lords. For those who lived through it, the plague was not just a disaster, it was a turning point. Surviving a plague outbreak in medieval times wasn't simply a matter of hiding away. It demanded an entirely new rhythm of life. Once the first wave of deaths passed, many peasants found themselves living in a half-empty village, where the silence itself felt unnatural. The habits that had defined their daily existence, working in close-knit groups, visiting neighbors, gathering in the square, were abandoned or carefully altered. The priority was reducing contact. In the fields, workers spread out far apart instead of toiling side by side. Families avoided lending tools or sharing food unless absolutely necessary. Even the communal oven, once the heartbeat of a village, became a place of caution. Bread was baked in separate batches, with each family retrieving their loaves without lingering. Caring for the sick took a brutal practicality. In normal times, the sickbed was a place of comfort, where family members stayed close, offering broth and prayer. During plague years, caregivers sometimes wore rough coverings over their faces, linen cloth soaked in vinegar or wrapped with herbs, believing it would protect them from bad air. When the illness struck too quickly, some chose to place food and water within reach of the sick and then leave them isolated, a grim measure meant to save the rest of the household. Food itself became a central concern. With labor reduced, harvests shrank. Villagers leaned heavily on whatever they had stored from previous seasons: dried beans, smoked fish, salted pork, and hard rye bread that could last months if kept dry. Fresh produce became rare, and diets grew monotonous. Some families resorted to foraging, sending older children to collect edible plants, nuts, and berries from nearby woods. Trade, too, was transformed. Before the plague, peasants relied on peddlers and traveling merchants for goods they couldn't make themselves: metal tools, fine cloth, salt, and spices. During outbreaks, these visitors were often barred from entering. Instead, a makeshift system developed. Merchants left goods at designated spots outside the village, and locals paid by leaving coins in bowls of vinegar to purify them before exchange. Social bonds, so vital in peasant life, were tested. Without the gatherings that normally bound people together, mistrust crept in. Some suspected neighbors of hoarding food or hiding sickness. Disputes over land and inheritance rose sharply, as so many deaths left property without clear heirs. Village elders and reeves, local officials, had to settle these matters quickly, often bending or ignoring older customs simply to keep order. Religion remained both a comfort and a source of division. Priests preached that repentance and piety could ward off God's wrath, and some villagers took to constant prayer, fasting, and wearing religious tokens. But not all responded with humility. Some abandoned restraint altogether, reasoning that if death was inevitable, they might as well indulge while they could. Feasts, drunken nights, and reckless behavior became surprisingly common in certain places, a desperate attempt to reclaim joy in the shadow of death. Meanwhile, the belief in supernatural causes grew stronger. Some peasants blamed the alignment of planets, witches, or poisoned wells. Rumors spread quickly in an age without written news, and in a few cases, they led to tragic violence against outsiders, travelers, or minority communities accused of bringing the disease. Those who chose isolation often paid a different price: loneliness. Life on a small farm away from the village could be physically safer, but it left people without help if disaster struck, whether from illness, accident, or hunger. A broken plow or a failed fire could mean death if no neighbor was near to assist. Yet necessity drove innovation. Some peasants began to store more food than ever before, building small granaries or digging pits lined with straw to preserve grain for years. Others experimented with hardier crops that could survive neglect: turnips, cabbages, and beans, because in plague times, there was no guarantee the whole field would be tended. Over time, certain patterns emerged. Families who had weathered previous outbreaks often had stronger survival habits, maintaining clean water sources, avoiding overcrowded homes, and preparing for shortages even in healthy years. These practices, while not foolproof, gave them an edge when disease returned. One of the most lasting changes during prolonged plague periods was the loosening of feudal obligations. When a lord's estate lost half its workers, it became nearly impossible to enforce every labor demand. Peasants who survived could negotiate for reduced duties or even leave to work elsewhere. While some lords tried to resist, the reality was simple. Without enough hands, crops rotted in the fields, and animals went untended. Survival often meant compromise. Children grew up faster in such times. With many adults gone, young boys and girls were thrust into roles usually reserved for their elders: plowing, guarding animals, repairing fences, and carrying water. In the absence of normal schooling or apprenticeships, these children learned survival skills first, literacy and craft second. The emotional toll was profound. Survivors carried grief for lost parents, siblings, and friends, but also a strange resilience. Having seen life reduced to its bare essentials, many peasants emerged from plague years with a sharper sense of what truly mattered: food, shelter, and trustworthy companions. Luxuries faded from importance. Practical skills and loyal allies rose in value. As the disease lingered in waves, peasants learned to live with its presence rather than expecting a quick end. Outbreaks became another part of the cycle of life, like famine or war, terrible, but survivable with preparation, caution, and a bit of luck. Villages might shrink, merge, or relocate entirely, but the people endured, reshaping their traditions to fit a harsher world. By the time a plague year finally subsided, the survivors were not the same as before. They had adapted to a world where death could arrive without warning, and in doing so, they had laid the groundwork for a new order, one where the balance between lord and laborer was shifting, slowly but permanently. When the worst wave of plague finally passed, the landscape of a medieval village was almost unrecognizable. Fields lay untended, weeds choking the once neat rows of barley and wheat. Roads were quieter, with far fewer carts moving between settlements. The absence of familiar voices, the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter at the well, the laughter of children, created a silence that felt unnatural. For the survivors, the first challenge was simply taking stock. Many households had lost members, sometimes the only skilled worker who knew how to plow straight or mend a roof. Inheritance disputes were common, as cousins, distant relatives, and even unrelated neighbors claimed abandoned property. In places where no one was left to inherit, the lord often absorbed the land into his demesne, but maintaining it with a reduced workforce was another matter entirely. Rebuilding the workforce became the top priority for lords and village leaders alike. Surviving peasants suddenly found themselves in a position of rare bargaining power. With labor in short supply, they could demand better conditions, reduced rent, lighter work obligations, or permission to farm additional land for themselves. Some negotiated to pay cash rents instead of labor, freeing them from the most grueling feudal tasks. Others simply left to seek better offers elsewhere, ignoring the old laws that bound them to their lord's estate. The church also played a role in recovery. Many monasteries and parish churches took in orphans, though their resources were stretched thin. Priests preached sermons about the plague as a divine warning, urging repentance, but they also blessed the fields and held processions to mark the cleansing of the land. For peasants, these rituals served both a spiritual and psychological function, helping them believe life could be restored to normal, even if it would never be quite the same. Cemeteries expanded, sometimes into neighboring fields. In some villages, the hastily dug plague pits were later replaced by proper markers or small chapels built to honor the dead. These sites became points of remembrance, places where peasants gathered not only to pray but to remind themselves of their shared survival. Food production was slow to recover. The loss of skilled labor meant some techniques were forgotten or done poorly. To make up for the shortfall, many communities shifted to less labor-intensive farming, raising sheep for wool instead of growing grain, or planting hardy root vegetables like turnips that needed minimal care. This shift had economic consequences. Wool became more valuable, and villages closer to trade routes often prospered, while grain-dependent settlements struggled longer. Daily routines adjusted to the new reality. Many peasants kept the habits they had adopted during the plague years, maintaining larger food stores, avoiding overcrowding in homes, and keeping water sources cleaner. It wasn't understood in modern medical terms, but experience had shown that these measures seemed to reduce sickness. These changes formed a kind of inherited wisdom, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Marriage patterns also shifted. With so many young adults dead, widows and widowers often remarried quickly, sometimes to partners they barely knew, simply to secure labor for the farm and care for existing children. In some cases, women gained greater influence, especially widows who inherited land or led households in the absence of male relatives. While still bound by patriarchal norms, these women sometimes held more authority in village affairs than before. Economically, the scarcity of workers brought unexpected benefits for peasants. Wages rose for those who worked for pay, and in regions where serfdom was already weakening, the plague accelerated its decline. Lords who once relied on a bound labor force now had to compete for workers, sometimes offering contracts that granted more freedom and better living conditions. Yet recovery was uneven. Some areas rebounded within a few years, especially those with fertile soil, good trade access, and a healthy surviving population. Others, particularly remote villages that lost most of their people, never recovered at all. Abandoned houses slowly collapsing, fields returning to forest. In such cases, the land was sometimes claimed by neighboring settlements, but just as often it remained empty for decades. Culturally, the memory of the plague lingered. Folk songs, stories, and even crude carvings began to reference the Great Sickness, often mixing real experiences with superstition. Some depicted the plague as a skeletal figure or a shadow that passed silently through the night. These images became part of the peasant worldview, a reminder that disaster could strike at any time. Over time, these lessons shaped not only individual behavior but also the broader social structure. The fragile balance between lords and peasants tilted slightly in favor of the latter. While feudalism did not collapse overnight, the cracks deepened. More peasants became tenant farmers rather than bound serfs, and the idea that one could move to a new village or negotiate better terms began to feel less like rebellion and more like an accepted possibility. For children who grew up during or just after the plague, survival stories became part of their identity. They learned from their parents how to prepare for shortages, how to spot the signs of sickness early, and how to work independently when neighbors could not help. These skills, passed down, created a generation both more cautious and more adaptable than their predecessors. In the years that followed, life regained some of its old rhythms, plowing in spring, harvesting in autumn, gathering for religious festivals. But the plague years had left an unspoken rule in peasant society. Never assume stability. Famine, disease, or war could always return. Preparedness, adaptability, and mutual aid were not luxuries. They were necessities. By the mid-14th and 15th centuries, waves of plague continued to reappear, though often less devastating than the first. Each time, the survival strategies refined in earlier outbreaks were put to use, allowing communities to endure with fewer losses. It was a grim kind of progress, but progress nonetheless. In the end, the peasants who survived did so not because they defeated the plague in any modern sense, but because they learned to live alongside the possibility of death, reshaping their work, homes, and relationships to give themselves the best chance of seeing another year. And in that resilience lay the seeds of social changes that would echo far beyond the Middle Ages. Famine was a shadow that hung constantly over the lives of medieval peasants, even in years when the harvest was good. Unlike plague, which came in devastating but irregular waves, famine could creep in gradually, the result of too much rain, too little sun, early frosts, insect infestations, or war disrupting trade and farming. In a world without modern storage, transportation, or agricultural science, a bad harvest in one season could mean hunger for the next year, and sometimes death. The most common cause of famine was climate-related. The medieval period included what historians now call the Little Ice Age, a time of cooler temperatures that began in the late Middle Ages. Crops such as wheat, barley, and rye, staples of peasant diets, were sensitive to both frost and excessive rain. If the grain didn't ripen in time, it could rot in the fields or sprout prematurely, making it unusable. A single summer of poor weather could slash yields in half. Disease also affected crops. Fungal infections like ergot could infest rye, turning the grain toxic. Eating bread made from such grain caused symptoms ranging from hallucinations to gangrene, and entire villages might suffer in years when no clean grain was available. Insects, too, could destroy months of labor. Locust swarms or outbreaks of grain beetles were rare but devastating, leaving fields stripped bare. Beyond nature, human actions could cause famine. Wars between rival lords or kingdoms often led to scorched fields, stolen livestock, and the destruction of mills. Even if the land was fertile, peasants couldn't always plant or harvest safely when armed men roamed the countryside. Lords sometimes demanded rents or tithes even in bad years, forcing peasants to hand over food that they desperately needed for their families. When famine loomed, the first sign was usually rising bread prices. Grain was the backbone of the medieval diet, so when supplies dwindled, prices could double or triple in weeks. Peasants who grew their own grain were better off, but they still had to buy other essentials like salt, oil, and sometimes seed for next season's planting. Those without enough land or who had suffered crop failure themselves often had to sell possessions, tools, livestock, or even clothing to buy food. Communities had a few strategies to prepare for or survive famine, though these were limited by technology and resources. Many villages kept common granaries where surplus grain could be stored, often under the control of the church or the local lord. In good years, peasants might contribute part of their harvest to this store, drawing from it in times of need. However, these reserves were often small, and corruption or favoritism sometimes meant the grain went first to wealthier tenants. At the household level, peasants preserved food wherever possible. Grain could be stored in sealed bins or clay pots, beans and peas dried for winter, and root vegetables like turnips or parsnips buried in pits to keep them from freezing. Meat was salted or smoked, though this was expensive and typically only done after slaughtering animals in autumn. Milk could be turned into hard cheese, which lasted longer, though it wasn't always enough to sustain a family through a long winter. When famine truly struck, peasants were forced to stretch their diets in desperate ways. Bread might be made with a higher proportion of chaff or bran, reducing nutrition but increasing bulk. Wild plants, nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, were gathered for soups. Acorns, chestnuts, and even tree bark could be ground into meal to mix with flour. These foods kept people alive, but they were far less nourishing than grain, leading to weakness over time. Livestock were both a blessing and a gamble in famine years. Chickens could still produce eggs even with limited feed, and goats could graze on rough scrub, providing milk. But larger animals like cattle or pigs required more food than they were worth to keep alive. Many peasants slaughtered livestock early in a famine, eating some fresh meat and preserving the rest. But this meant fewer animals for plowing or breeding the following year, deepening the hardship. Social ties became critical. Peasants might share what little they had with relatives, hoping the favor would be returned in the future. The church sometimes organized alms distribution, where grain or bread was given to the poorest. Lords who wanted to maintain loyalty might lower rents, forgive debts, or release food from their own stores, though such acts were as much political as charitable. For those truly desperate, survival often meant breaking the law. Theft increased sharply in famine years. Grain stolen from storehouses, livestock driven off in the night, fishing in rivers without permission, or hunting in the Lord's forest. Punishments for such crimes could be severe, but many risked it when their families were starving. In some cases, entire households abandoned their village to wander in search of food, joining the swelling numbers of beggars and vagrants on the roads. The psychological toll of famine was immense. Hunger gnawed not just at the stomach but at the mind, creating irritability, hopelessness, and, in some cases, violence. Quarrels over resources could split families and neighbors apart. Even when famine ended, the memory lingered, influencing how people planted, stored, and shared food in the years that followed. Some villages adapted by changing their agricultural focus. In areas hit by repeated crop failures, peasants might switch to hardier grains like oats or barley, or increase sheep grazing for wool production, which could be traded for food from elsewhere. This diversification could make a community more resilient, but it required time, coordination, and sometimes the approval of the Lord. Ultimately, famine survival was a balancing act of preparation, adaptation, and community support. While no peasant could control the weather or the demands of their lord, those who learned to store more, plant wisely, and maintain good relations with neighbors had the best chance of enduring the lean years. When famine dragged on beyond a single season, the consequences deepened. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making peasants more vulnerable to diseases that might have otherwise been survivable. Even minor infections could become deadly in a starving body. Wounds healed more slowly, children grew stunted, and women sometimes stopped menstruating altogether, a grim but natural response to prolonged hunger. The connection between famine and plague was well known to medieval people, even if they didn't understand germ theory. Starving communities were perfect breeding grounds for illness because people crowded together in search of help, shared contaminated food, and lacked the strength to fight off infections. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, was followed by waves of disease that killed millions across Europe. Social order often frayed during prolonged hunger. With resources stretched thin, tensions between peasants and their lords could erupt into open resistance. Demands for taxes or tithes during a famine year were deeply resented, and in rare but notable cases, desperate villagers refused to pay or even rebelled. However, outright uprisings were dangerous. Lords had the military power to crush dissent, and punishment for defiance could include executions or mass fines. The church's role in famine was complicated. On one hand, monasteries and parish churches were often among the best organized food distributors in times of crisis. Monks kept more reliable grain stores than most peasants, and they saw charity as a religious duty. On the other hand, the church continued to demand tithes even in famine years, which could make the situation worse for the poorest families. This dual role, as both benefactor and burden, meant that peasants' feelings toward the church could shift quickly depending on how compassionate the local clergy were. Trade offered some hope in famine years, but it wasn't always accessible to the rural poor. If one region's harvest failed while another's succeeded, merchants could transport grain. Yet the cost of imported food was often too high for peasants. Worse, merchants sometimes hoarded grain to drive up prices, creating shortages even where supplies existed. This led to accusations of profiteering and occasional riots in market towns. Migration was another survival strategy, though it came with enormous risks. Families might send one or two members to distant relatives or into towns to look for work, reducing the number of mouths to feed at home. In extreme cases, entire villages relocated, abandoning their land. This was especially common in marginal areas, rocky hillsides or flood-prone valleys, where repeated crop failures made life untenable. However, moving meant losing legal rights to one's fields, which could leave a family landless forever. Children suffered disproportionately in famine. They had smaller reserves of body fat and muscle, so starvation claimed them more quickly. Parents sometimes made heartbreaking decisions to prioritize feeding the strongest children or the adults who could still work the fields. In some accounts from severe famines, parents even left infants at monastery doors, hoping monks or nuns would take them in. The mortality rate among children during multi-year famines could reach devastating levels, reshaping the demographics of a village for decades. Cultural attitudes toward famine also shaped survival strategies. Medieval peasants lived in a worldview where disasters were often interpreted as divine punishment. Bad harvests might be seen as the result of moral failings, sins of the community, or the wrath of God. This belief could lead to public acts of repentance, fasts, processions, or pilgrimages, sometimes even during starvation. While such actions didn't change the weather, they could strengthen communal bonds, giving people the psychological resilience to endure hardship. Famine also entered folklore. Stories of past hunger years were passed down to teach caution and preparedness. Grandparents might remind children of the winter when even the dogs starved, or the summer when we ate nettles for bread. These cautionary tales encouraged peasants to store as much as possible in good years and to respect the fragility of life. In this way, memory itself became a survival tool. One notable feature of famine years was the emergence of alternative economies. When coinage or grain became scarce, people bartered for goods and services. A pair of shoes might be traded for a sack of peas, or labor in another's field exchanged for a portion of bread. This barter system allowed communities to keep functioning even when formal markets collapsed. However, it also deepened inequalities. Those with valuable skills or goods could secure food, while others had nothing to trade. Desperation sometimes pushed people towards superstition and scapegoating. In certain regions, witches, heretics, or marginalized groups like Jews were accused of causing crop failures through curses or sorcery. Such accusations could lead to violence or expulsions, further destabilizing communities already under strain. While not universal, this pattern appeared often enough in medieval Europe to be a dark recurring theme in famine history. The long-term recovery from famine was slow. Even after good harvests returned, villages faced shortages of labor if many had died. Fields might be overgrown or neglected, tools rusted, and seed stocks depleted. Families who had sold livestock or possessions during the famine might take years to rebuild their herds and equipment. This meant that even a short famine of 1 or 2 years could have repercussions for a generation. Peasants who survived often carried a deep sense of caution. They might plant extra crops, just in case, keep hidden caches of food, or form closer alliances with neighbors for mutual aid. Some even sought service in monasteries or towns as a way to escape the vulnerability of rural farming life. The shared trauma of famine could permanently alter migration patterns, agricultural methods, and community structures. In the end, famine in medieval peasant life was not an occasional disaster but an expected challenge, as much a part of the cycle of life as sowing and harvest. Survival depended on a combination of foresight, luck, and human solidarity. Those who endured carried not just the physical scars of hunger, but the cultural memory that shaped how future generations prepared for the lean years that, sooner or later, would always come again. While famine was an ever-present threat, it was not evenly distributed across medieval Europe. Some regions were blessed with more fertile soil, milder climates, or better irrigation, making them less vulnerable to crop failure. The great river valleys of the Seine, Po, and Danube, for instance, could usually produce surplus grain even in dry years, whereas upland or marginal areas, such as the Scottish Highlands or the mountain villages of the Alps, were far more exposed to hunger. Geography could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Lords, too, varied in their response to famine. Some were harsh landlords, demanding their due in rent or labor regardless of conditions. Others took a more paternal approach, forgiving debts, distributing stored grain, or organizing relief measures. The motivations behind such generosity were not always purely charitable. A lord who allowed his peasants to die or flee risked losing the labor needed to work his lands in future years. As a result, self-interest often aligned with acts of mercy, even if compassion was not the driving force. Certain crops acted as lifesavers during poor harvests. Barley, oats, and rye could grow in less favorable conditions than wheat, and peasants often relied on them in lean years. Root vegetables like turnips or parsnips, though less prestigious than bread, could be stored through the winter and provide essential calories. Foraging in the surrounding countryside, gathering nuts, berries, mushrooms, and edible leaves was a common supplement, though overharvesting could quickly deplete local resources. Livestock played a dual role in famine. On one hand, animals were valuable assets, providing milk, eggs, and occasional meat. On the other, they required fodder, which could be scarce during bad harvests. In extreme conditions, peasants sometimes slaughtered breeding stock for immediate food, a desperate choice that jeopardized their long-term agricultural stability. In the aftermath, villages might face years without enough animals to plow fields or produce dairy. The psychological toll of famine was significant. Starvation eroded not just the body but also the mind, leading to lethargy, despair, and, in some cases, fatalism. Chronic hunger could weaken social bonds, as people became consumed with the struggle to survive. Neighbors who once helped each other might hoard supplies, avoid visitors, or refuse to share. Yet in other cases, famine inspired acts of remarkable generosity, families taking in orphans, sharing their last stores of grain, or risking punishment to poach game for those in need. Religious rituals often intensified during famine. Special prayers for rain or good harvests were recited, and saints' relics might be carried in processions to bless the fields. In some regions, folk traditions blended with Christian practice. Peasants might light bonfires on certain feast days, believing the smoke would drive away blight, or bury charms in their fields to protect the next crop. While modern science dismisses these practices, they gave people a sense of agency in a situation largely beyond their control. Famine was also a political issue. In times of widespread hunger, kings or regional rulers sometimes intervened, ordering price controls, banning grain exports, or distributing state-held stores. However, such measures could be poorly enforced, especially in remote rural areas where local lords held more immediate authority. Political unrest was a real danger. Hungry subjects were more likely to riot, resist taxation, or support rebellions. The end of a famine was rarely a clean break. Even when the weather improved and crops returned, rebuilding took time. Seed stocks needed replenishment, livestock herds needed years to regrow, and the weakened population was more vulnerable to illness. In some cases, a famine acted as a slow-motion catastrophe, with mortality continuing for years afterward due to disease and poverty. Peasants developed strategies to avoid being caught unprepared again. One of the most important was diversification, planting multiple types of crops, keeping different animals, and maintaining small gardens for herbs and vegetables. Those who could afford it might invest in sturdier storage facilities to protect grain from damp, pests, or theft. Others forged stronger ties with relatives in different regions, hoping to rely on them if famine struck again. Over time, the recurring cycle of feast and famine shaped peasant culture. Songs, proverbs, and seasonal customs all reflected the deep awareness that good years were never guaranteed. The saying, "Store for 7 years, eat for 1," captured the ethos of cautious resource management. Festivals celebrating the harvest were infused with gratitude, not just for abundance but for the hope of survival through the next winter. In the broader medieval economy, famine had a paradoxical effect. While it devastated the poor, it could sometimes benefit wealthier merchants and lords, who profited from high grain prices. This uneven impact deepened social divisions, fueling resentment and sometimes sparking class conflict. Yet famine also reminded everyone, from serf to king, that human power had limits in the face of nature's unpredictability. In the grand sweep of medieval life, famine was less a rare disaster than a recurring trial. It tested communities' resilience, exposed the fragility of their systems, and shaped the moral choices of individuals and institutions alike. For peasants, surviving famine was not just about enduring hunger. It was about navigating a web of social obligations, local politics, and personal sacrifices. Those who lived through it carried the experience as both a caution and a testament to human endurance. With famine's shadow always looming, medieval peasants learned to live in a state of readiness. The next part of our story will examine an equally persistent danger, the spread of plague, and how the lessons of famine both helped and failed them when disease swept through their villages. If famine was a slow-moving disaster that starved villages over months or years, plague was the sudden, brutal hammer blow that could empty an entire settlement in a matter of weeks. Medieval peasants lived in constant awareness of disease, sometimes as seasonal outbreaks of familiar illnesses, sometimes as the arrival of a strange, unstoppable sickness that seemed to strike without warning. The greatest of these calamities, and the one that still shapes historical memory, was the Black Death of the mid-14th century. But plague in the Middle Ages was not limited to the Black Death. Before and after that infamous pandemic, medieval Europe endured repeated epidemics, dysentery sweeping through during wet summers, ergotism poisoning from contaminated rye, influenza-like fevers in winter, and smallpox striking children. Most villages expected that in any given decade, some sickness would visit and claim lives. What made the Black Death stand apart was its unprecedented scale and the terror it inspired. The plague's arrival in 1347 to 1348 was almost like a supernatural event to those who lived through it. Merchants brought the disease along established trade routes, likely from Central Asia through the Middle East and into Europe by ship. By the time it reached the coastal towns, it spread inland rapidly, traveling with traders, pilgrims, and soldiers. Within months, it had leapt from one side of the continent to the other, killing tens of millions in just a few years. For peasants, the experience of plague began with rumors, stories of distant towns, where no one lived anymore, of carts carrying bodies to mass graves, of the stench of decay that preceded the sickness. Then came the reality, neighbors falling ill with fever, chills, and the dreaded buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes. The speed was terrifying. A person could seem healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Medical knowledge at the time was rudimentary, and peasants relied on a mixture of folk remedies, herbal cures, and religious rituals to protect themselves. Garlic, vinegar-soaked cloths, and fumigating herbs like rosemary or juniper were common attempts to purify the air. Since many believed disease spread through miasma, bad smells, or corrupted air, village healers might bleed the sick to balance their humors or prescribe poultices to draw out the poison, but such treatments rarely made a difference. The church played a central role in interpreting plague. Many peasants saw it as divine punishment for sin, and processions of penitents were organized to beg for God's mercy. In some places, this religious fervor took a darker turn. blaming outsiders such as Jewish communities or foreigners for poisoning wells or spreading the disease. Such accusations could lead to violent persecution, adding a layer of human cruelty to an already devastating crisis. Fear reshaped daily life almost overnight. Villages might bar their gates to outsiders, markets could be suspended, and people avoided gatherings, even church services, despite their deep faith. In some areas, those who could afford it fled to the countryside in hopes of escaping the sickness, though the disease's speed and reach often made such flight useless. For peasants bound to the land by obligation or poverty, there was no choice but to endure and hope. Burial practices changed under the sheer weight of mortality. Parish graveyards quickly overflowed, forcing the creation of mass pits where bodies were laid without ceremony. The loss of priests meant fewer last rites and blessings, deepening the sense of abandonment. Survivors often took on the grim task of burying their own family members, wrapping them in cloth and carrying them to the nearest consecrated ground, if any was still open. The psychological shock of plague was profound. Many survivors described it as a kind of apocalypse, when normal rules and bonds seemed to dissolve. There were stories of parents abandoning sick children or siblings refusing to help one another out of fear. Yet there were also accounts of remarkable bravery, neighbors tending to the ill despite the danger, priests staying behind to comfort the dying, and entire communities coming together to care for orphaned children. Economically, the plague's immediate impact was catastrophic. Fields went unharvested, livestock roamed untended, and trade ground to a halt. Shortages of labor compounded the effects of famine in the years that followed, making recovery slow. But paradoxically, for those peasants who survived, the long-term effects could be unexpectedly positive. Land became available, wages rose, and the rigid bonds of serfdom began to weaken as lords struggled to attract workers. In this way, plague was not just a destroyer but also an agent of change. It rebalanced the relationship between peasants and lords, undermined the social order, and set in motion transformations that would reshape medieval society. But in the moment, for those who lived through its shadow, it was simply the most terrifying experience of their lives. A reminder that in the medieval world, death was never far away, and life was often subject to forces beyond anyone's control. In the next part, we will look more closely at how medieval peasants adapted to recurring waves of plague, the coping strategies they developed, and how survival shaped their culture and economy for generations. If the first arrival of plague was like a lightning strike, the years that followed were more like a series of storms. The Black Death was not a single, isolated disaster. It returned again and again in smaller but still deadly waves, forcing medieval peasants to adapt their lives to a grim new reality. Historians estimate that major plague outbreaks recurred roughly every decade or two in parts of Europe for the next 300 years. Some generations saw 2 or 3 flare-ups within their lifetime. For peasants, this meant that plague became less of a rare horror and more of a predictable, if unwelcome, part of life, like a terrible season that might or might not come, but for which you had to be ready. These recurring outbreaks taught survivors certain patterns. People learned that crowded gatherings often preceded outbreaks, so they were more cautious about fairs, markets, and pilgrimages. Villages might set up makeshift quarantine zones, small huts on the edge of the settlement where strangers or returning travelers were kept for days before being allowed in. These measures were rudimentary compared to modern public health, but they showed a growing awareness of contagion, even without understanding germs. Cultural memory of the plague influenced behavior in other ways. Survivors often passed down personal stories, tales of entire households lost, of mysterious symptoms, or of the year the village bells rang every day. These oral histories reinforced vigilance in younger generations. Some even carried talismans or wore certain herbs like rue and wormwood in small pouches as a constant precaution, even in years without outbreaks. Religious responses also shifted over time. In the first wave, penitential processions and mass gatherings were common, even though they likely worsened the spread. By later outbreaks, some church leaders advised against such events, focusing instead on individual prayer, the ringing of church bells to ward off disease, and blessing houses with holy water. Clergy adapted burial rites so they could be performed more quickly or at a distance, reducing contact with the sick. One of the most important adaptations was economic. In regions where repeated plagues reduced the population significantly, lords could not afford to lose the labor they had left. This meant that even peasants bound to the land by serfdom often found themselves in a position to negotiate better terms, fewer days of unpaid labor, lower rents, or even outright freedom in exchange for staying and working. Lords who resisted risked losing workers entirely to neighboring estates offering better conditions. Peasants also adjusted their agricultural practices to cope with unpredictable labor shortages. Families began planting crops that required less upkeep or could survive neglect if the household fell ill. Rye instead of wheat, for example, or beans and peas instead of more labor-intensive vegetables. Livestock management also shifted. Instead of maintaining large herds that demanded constant care, peasants often kept fewer but more valuable animals. Plague fear even influenced settlement patterns. Some small hamlets that were devastated in the first wave were simply abandoned, their survivors relocating to larger villages with more resources and better protection. Over time, this consolidation made communities more resilient, though it also meant that future outbreaks could still spread quickly through these denser populations. Socially, plague years became part of the village calendar alongside harvests, festivals, and religious holidays. People learned to read the signs. A sudden increase in illness in a nearby market town, a rumor from a passing traveler, or news from the parish priest. This readiness did not eliminate the danger, but it reduced the shock and chaos that had marked the first arrival of the Black Death. Interestingly, some cultural expressions flourished during the plague era. Art, song, and storytelling often reflected themes of death and survival. The danse macabre motif, skeletons leading people of all walks of life in a grim procession, became popular in church murals, reminding everyone that death was the great equalizer. For peasants, such imagery may have served both as a warning and a strange comfort, reinforcing the idea that even kings and lords could not escape the fate they themselves faced. Another subtle but significant change was in personal relationships. Plague loss created a constant sense of uncertainty, making bonds within families and among neighbors more valuable. Marriages might happen sooner, inheritances passed down earlier, and friendships deepened by shared survival. Communities learned to organize quickly to care for the sick, guard the harvest, or bury the dead, mutual aid born from repeated hardship. However, not all consequences were positive. The trauma of recurring plagues sometimes bred suspicion and scapegoating. Outsiders, beggars, or travelers might be viewed with fear, accused of bringing the sickness. Certain minority groups, particularly Jews in some regions, faced renewed persecution during each outbreak, as old prejudices were rekindled by fresh panic. These patterns of blame revealed both the resilience and the fragility of medieval peasant society. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, recurring plagues had reshaped the very structure of rural life. Labor was scarcer, wages higher, and peasants less tightly bound to their lords. Some villages prospered from this shift, while others struggled with depopulation and economic decline. But for the average peasant, survival depended on adaptability, the willingness to change work patterns, embrace new protective measures, and maintain strong community ties in the face of an invisible, relentless threat. In the next part, we will explore how these recurring plagues accelerated the decline of serfdom, transformed the relationship between peasants and lords, and laid the groundwork for major social changes in late medieval Europe. By the time the second and third plague waves swept through Europe, the old feudal balance between lord and peasant was already starting to tilt. In the decades before the Black Death, lords had the upper hand. Labor was plentiful, and peasants had few choices but to work the land under heavy obligations. After the repeated outbreaks, that dynamic was no longer secure. The sheer reduction in population created a scarcity of workers that could not be ignored. Whole villages lost half or more of their households, and even the most powerful estates faced empty fields. Grain production dropped, livestock numbers fell, and with them the income of landowners. For the first time in generations, lords found themselves competing for labor rather than commanding it. Peasants quickly recognized this shift. Men and women who survived the plague could now demand better wages or lighter duties. A skilled plowman might negotiate for fewer days of corvée labor in exchange for staying on the estate. Shepherds and dairy workers could bargain for more favorable grazing rights or a share of the product. Entire families sometimes relocated to a lord who offered more freedom or higher pay, a practice that was once unthinkable under strict serfdom. This labor mobility was deeply threatening to the feudal system. Lords and kings across Europe responded with attempts to freeze wages and bind peasants to their land again. The most famous example is England's Statute of Labourers, 1351, which tried to cap wages at pre-plague levels and punish workers who left their employers without permission. Similar laws appeared in France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Italy, but enforcement proved nearly impossible. There simply weren't enough officials to police the countryside, and in many cases local authorities quietly ignored the rules because they, too, needed laborers. Even when fines or punishments were imposed, the lure of better pay or conditions often outweighed the risk. Peasants had tasted bargaining power, and it was not easily forgotten. The plague years also weakened the traditional obligations of serfdom in other ways. When a serf family died out, their plot might be left vacant or leased out on more favorable terms to attract new tenants. Lords desperate to keep their lands productive sometimes offered reduced rents or granted partial freedoms, allowing peasants to sell surplus crops, own livestock outright, or pass land to their children without interference. Over time, these concessions chipped away at the rigid controls that had once defined rural life. In some areas, recurring plagues accelerated the outright collapse of serfdom. In England, for instance, by the late 14th century, many peasants were essentially free tenants, paying rent in cash rather than working the lord's land. This monetization of obligations shifted the economy toward a more market-driven structure and gave peasants greater independence in deciding how and where to work. The social consequences were profound. Formerly rigid hierarchies loosened as peasants acquired more disposable income and mobility. Some used their newfound freedom to acquire better tools, expand their holdings, or send children to learn trades in nearby towns. Others invested in livestock, particularly sheep, which required less labor than grain farming but could bring higher profits through wool sales. Recurring plague also affected inheritance patterns. With more frequent deaths, land often changed hands faster, allowing younger generations to take control sooner. This could lead to more innovative farming practices, as new landholders experimented with crop rotations or diversified production to reduce risk. Lords who failed to adapt to these changes often saw their estates decline, while those who worked with their tenants, granting more autonomy in exchange for loyalty, were better able to recover. Culturally, this period fostered a new sense of self-worth among peasants. Survival in the face of repeated plague carried its own social weight, and communities began to value practical skills, farming, animal husbandry, carpentry, over pure obedience to feudal custom. The idea that a person's value could be measured by their work and reliability rather than their birth status subtly undermined the ideological foundation of feudalism. Of course, these changes were not welcomed by everyone. Many lords resented their loss of control and saw peasant assertiveness as a dangerous challenge to the established order. This tension occasionally erupted into open conflict. The most famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where anger over high taxes, wage restrictions, and feudal obligations boiled over into violence. Though the revolt was suppressed, it signaled that peasants were no longer passive subjects. They were political actors who could organize and demand change. Religious attitudes also evolved alongside these economic and social shifts. The church, like the nobility, had suffered losses during the plague and often had to grant more leeway to peasants in managing parish lands or participating in local governance. While faith remained central to peasant life, the experience of repeated catastrophe and partial self-reliance encouraged a more personal approach to spirituality, with greater emphasis on individual prayer and lay religious groups. By the end of the 15th century, in much of Western Europe, the feudal relationship between lord and peasant had been permanently altered. Plague had done what centuries of political reform could not. It broke the rigid bonds of serfdom through sheer demographic force and economic necessity. Peasants were not yet equal to lords, but they had more leverage, more choices, and a greater ability to shape their own destinies than their ancestors had known. The repeated trials of plague had taught them valuable lessons, that survival sometimes depended on mobility, that scarcity could be a bargaining tool, and that communities could endure even when the social order was shaken to its core. These lessons would carry forward into the later medieval period, influencing everything from village governance to the slow emergence of early modern economies. In the next section, we will turn from plague to famine, examining how the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 and other food shortages shaped peasant survival strategies long before the Black Death arrived. Before the Black Death ever reached European shores, another catastrophe had already tested the endurance of medieval peasants, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. While plague struck suddenly and sporadically, famine was a slower, grinding disaster that could stretch over months or years. It stripped away reserves, eroded communities' stability, and left scars that lasted for generations. The Great Famine began with a sequence of bad harvests brought on by unusual weather. In the spring of 1315, heavy rains drenched much of northern Europe. Fields became waterlogged, seeds rotted in the ground, and livestock suffered from disease caused by the damp conditions. The summer was no better. Temperatures stayed cool, delaying the ripening of grains. When autumn came, the harvest was a fraction of its normal size. Medieval peasants were used to periodic shortages, but they relied on a delicate balance. A single poor harvest could be offset by reserves from the previous year, borrowed grain from wealthier neighbors, or purchases from nearby markets. But when poor harvests happened in consecutive years, the system collapsed. By 1316, the rains returned with equal force, and many communities had already exhausted their stores. The first to feel the strain were the landless laborers and the smallest tenant farmers. Without surplus grain or large livestock herds, they had no cushion against scarcity. They began to sell what few possessions they had: tools, clothing, even parts of their homes, to buy food. Once those resources were gone, many turned to begging or hired themselves out under desperate terms. As the famine deepened, it touched even more secure households. Grain prices tripled in some areas, making bread, the staple of the medieval diet, unaffordable for the poorest and a heavy burden for everyone else. Malnutrition spread quickly, especially among children and the elderly. Weakness from hunger made people more vulnerable to disease, and outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses followed. In some towns and villages, local authorities tried to regulate prices or forbid the hoarding of grain. Millers and bakers were watched closely to ensure they didn't dilute flour with husks or raise prices unfairly. But such measures could only go so far when there simply wasn't enough food to go around. In some desperate cases, grain was imported from distant regions, but poor roads, high transport costs, and the sheer scale of the crisis meant relief rarely arrived in time. The famine also forced changes in diet. With little wheat or rye available, people turned to less desirable grains like barley, oats, and millet. Peas, beans, and lentils became more important, though these too were affected by the wet conditions. In coastal regions, fish became a lifeline, while inland areas relied more heavily on dairy, eggs, and foraged foods. People gathered nuts, berries, mushrooms, and edible roots from forests, though competition for these resources was intense. Hunting game was theoretically another option, but strict laws reserved most large animals, deer, boar, swans, for the nobility. Peasants caught poaching faced harsh punishments. Even so, famine years saw an uptick in illegal hunting and fishing, with many willing to risk fines, beatings, or worse for the chance to feed their families. The famine also disrupted the agricultural cycle itself. Weak and malnourished farmers had less energy to plow fields, plant, and harvest. Many had to eat the seeds meant for planting, ensuring that the following year's harvest would be even smaller. Livestock losses were severe. Many animals were slaughtered early because their owners could not feed them through the winter. This reduced the availability of meat, milk, and manure for future crops, creating a vicious cycle of scarcity. Social tensions rose sharply during the famine. In some regions, rural banditry increased as starving people raided granaries or attacked merchants transporting food. Lords sometimes tightened control over their tenants, demanding labor or rents in kind even when harvests had failed, while others reduced obligations to prevent total collapse of their estates. In extreme cases, entire villages were abandoned as people fled in search of better conditions elsewhere. Religious interpretations of the famine were unavoidable in a deeply pious age. Many saw the relentless rain and poor harvests as a sign of God's anger, perhaps for collective sins or the moral failings of leaders. Processions, fasts, and special prayers were organized across Christendom in the hope of divine mercy. In some places, flagellant movements appeared, where groups of penitents publicly whipped themselves to atone for the sins of the world and beg for the end of suffering. By 1317, the weather began to improve, and harvests slowly returned to normal, but recovery was far from immediate. Malnourished populations were physically weakened, livestock herds had to be rebuilt, and fields reclaimed from neglect. Even after food became more available, prices stayed high for several years, keeping pressure on the poorest families. The psychological impact of the famine was long-lasting. It taught peasants the fragility of their survival and the danger of relying too heavily on a single staple crop. In its aftermath, some communities tried to diversify production, planting a mix of grains, legumes, and root vegetables. Others increased efforts to preserve food, drying fish, smoking meat, and storing grain more securely against pests and damp. The Great Famine also reshaped relationships between peasants and their lords. Where lords had shown generosity, opening storehouses, forgiving rents, or providing work, loyalty was often strengthened. But where they had been harsh or indifferent, resentment took root. In some places, these tensions simmered quietly for decades, only to explode during later crises like the Black Death or the peasant revolts of the 14th century. In the next part of this section, we'll look more closely at the survival strategies medieval peasants used during famines, from food preservation to mutual aid networks, and how these approaches could mean the difference between life and death. When famine struck, survival depended not just on luck but on resourcefulness, preparation, and community cooperation. Medieval peasants had no modern safety nets, but they did have a long tradition of coping mechanisms passed down through generations. Practices born of necessity in a world where bad harvests were an ever-present threat. 1. Preserving food for the lean months. Meat, when available, was salted, smoked, or dried to prolong its shelf life. Fish, especially in coastal areas or near rivers, was a crucial famine food. Salted herring, dried cod, and smoked eel could last months, and in some cases, years. Dairy products like cheese and butter were also valuable because they could be stored longer than fresh milk. Preservation wasn't foolproof. Rodents, insects, and mold could still destroy supplies, and in a severe famine, stores could be depleted months before the next harvest. But households that maintained even a small reserve had a distinct advantage. 2. Rationing and stretching resources when shortages loomed. Rationing became essential. Families reduced portion sizes, watered down pottage, a thick vegetable or grain stew, and bulked up meals with foraged greens or lower quality grains. Bread was sometimes made with a mix of flour and ground peas, beans, acorns, or even tree bark in desperate times. While these substitutions could keep people alive, they were far less nutritious. Long-term reliance on such foods weakened the body making disease more deadly. A grim reminder that survival in famine was often about enduring just long enough for conditions to improve. 3. Foraging in wild foods. Peasants had a deep knowledge of their local environment, and in times of famine, they drew heavily on wild resources. Woods, hedgerows, and meadows became sources of edible plants, berries, nuts, and mushrooms. Nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic were common greens. Hazelnuts, acorns, after leaching out tannins, and chestnuts could be ground into flour or eaten roasted. Roots like parsnips, turnips, and wild carrots were dug from fields or forest edges. In marshy areas, reeds and water plants provided edible shoots and tubers. Some of these foods were known as famine foods because they were bitter, labor-intensive to prepare, or otherwise unappealing under normal circumstances. 4. Fishing, hunting, and poaching. Access to wild game and fish could make the difference between life and death, but it often brought peasants into conflict with the law. Nobles strictly controlled hunting rights, and poaching was severely punished. Yet famine pushed many to ignore these restrictions. Rabbits, hares, pigeons, and wild birds were easier to catch than larger game and carried less risk of detection. Fishing was somewhat more accessible, though in many areas lords claimed rights over rivers and lakes. Nets, fish traps, and even simple spears were used to catch freshwater fish, eels, and amphibians. Coastal communities relied heavily on shellfish, which were abundant and required little equipment to harvest. 5. Mutual aid networks. One of the most important survival tools was community solidarity. Villages often shared resources, pooling grain or livestock to help the most vulnerable survive. Informal lending of food or seed grain was common, though repayment was expected once conditions improved. Families with larger herds might allow neighbors to milk their cows in exchange for labor. Women often organized communal cooking to make the most efficient use of scarce fuel and to ensure everyone received at least a little to eat. This mutual support was not purely altruistic. It strengthened the social fabric and ensured that, in future crises, aid would be reciprocated. However, when famine dragged on for years, even the strongest networks could fray under the strain. 6. Seasonal migration and labor seeking. When local conditions became unbearable, some peasants sought work in regions less affected by famine. Men might travel to larger towns to find day labor or serve as hired harvesters in areas with better yields. Women sometimes found work as servants or spinners. This movement could bring in food or wages, but it was risky. Traveling in a time of scarcity was dangerous, and newcomers were not always welcomed, especially if they were perceived as competing for limited resources. 7. Turning to the church and monasteries. The medieval church played a central role in famine relief. Monasteries, which often had larger and better managed estates, could sometimes provide bread, pottage, or ale to the needy. Parish churches organized almsgiving, funded by wealthy patrons or through the collection of special offerings. Hospitals, which at the time were more like almshouses, sometimes fed the poor, though their resources were limited. The moral duty to feed the hungry was a strong one in medieval Christian teaching, but in practice, help often fell short of demand. 8. Pawning and selling possessions. When food prices skyrocketed, peasants pawned tools, clothing, jewelry, or household goods for grain. In extreme cases, families sold pieces of land or livestock, undermining their long-term security. Some entered into unfavorable labor contracts or sold themselves into servitude to ensure survival. These measures were last resorts. They might save lives in the short term, but often trapped families in poverty for generations. 9. Desperate measures. Historical accounts from severe famines speak of extreme acts, eating unripe or spoiled grain despite the risk of illness, consuming animal feed, and, in some cases, reports of cannibalism. Such acts were rare but served as grim reminders of the desperation famine could provoke. 10. The role of resilience and adaptability. Ultimately, the peasants who survived famine tended to be those who combined several strategies: preserving food when possible, stretching rations creatively, foraging widely, leveraging community ties, and adapting quickly to changing conditions. Those without these resources or skills often did not survive. In the next part of this section, we'll examine how the experience of famine changed peasant society, shaping land use, agricultural practices, and relationships with lords in the years that followed. Famine was not just a temporary disaster. It left deep, lasting marks on medieval society. The aftermath often reshaped villages for years, sometimes decades, influencing farming practices, local politics, and even the way people viewed life itself. 1. Population loss and demographic shifts. Even in famines less severe than the Black Death, mortality rates could be staggering. Malnutrition made peasants more vulnerable to disease, meaning that famine and plague often went hand in hand. After the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, some English villages lost a third of their inhabitants. The deaths were not evenly distributed. The elderly, infants, and the already poor were most at risk, while households with more resources could weather the crisis. As a result, the social makeup of a village could shift dramatically. Empty cottages and abandoned plots became common, especially in marginal farming areas where survival was hardest. 2. Abandoned land and changing agriculture with fewer hands to work the fields. Some land simply went out of cultivation. Villages abandoned less fertile or more remote plots, focusing instead on their best soil. In some cases, entire hamlets were deserted. Over time, this concentration of labor on better land could improve efficiency. Lords sometimes converted abandoned arable land into pasture for sheep or cattle, as livestock required less labor to maintain. This shift could increase profits for landowners, especially as the medieval wool trade expanded, but it often displaced peasants who had once worked those fields. 3. Increased bargaining power for survivors. Ironically, the labor shortages caused by famine could sometimes benefit surviving peasants. With fewer workers available, lords had to compete to attract and retain labor. Wages could rise, and peasants might negotiate better terms of tenure, lighter labor services, or reduced rents. However, these gains were not guaranteed. Lords often resisted change, and in some regions, authorities tried to freeze wages or enforce pre-famine labor obligations. Nevertheless, in 4. Debt and dependence. For many households, famine meant falling into debt. Grain borrowed during the lean years had to be repaid, sometimes with high interest. Families that sold land or tools to survive found themselves with fewer means to earn a living, deepening their dependence on wealthier neighbors or the local lord. Debt could lock peasants into a cycle of poverty, forcing them into unfavorable agreements such as long-term labor contracts, sharecropping arrangements, or even permanent servitude. 5. Social tensions and conflicts. Famine strained the bonds of community. While mutual aid was a powerful survival tool, scarcity could just as easily breed resentment. Quarrels over foraging rights, accusations of grain hoarding, and disputes about access to lordly stores were common. In extreme cases, these tensions erupted into violence. There are records of grain riots in towns, and in rural areas, disputes between villages over access to resources could turn bloody. Lords who were perceived as withholding aid risked rebellion, while merchants accused of price gouging could face mob justice. 6. Religious and cultural responses. Famine was often interpreted through a religious lens. Many saw it as divine punishment for sin, prompting acts of collective repentance, processions, public prayers, and fasting. Some communities erected crosses or chapels in thanksgiving when the famine finally ended. On a personal level, famine experiences deepened the medieval awareness of mortality and the fragility of life. Sermons and moral tales from this period often stressed the virtues of charity, humility, and preparedness, while condemning greed and selfishness. 7. Legal and policy changes. Major famines sometimes led to changes in local laws. Lords might impose stricter controls on hunting, fishing, or foraging to protect their resources, or, conversely, relax restrictions temporarily to allow people to survive. In urban areas, authorities occasionally set maximum prices for bread and grain to prevent profiteering, though enforcement was uneven. Some towns maintained emergency grain reserves known as granaries of the poor, which could be sold at reduced prices during crises. 8. Technological and agricultural adaptations. The trauma of famine could spur innovation. Villages experimented with different crop rotations, new seed varieties, or improved drainage and irrigation to reduce the risk of future failure. In wetter parts of northern Europe, some communities built raised causeways and ditches to keep fields from flooding, a response to the catastrophic rains of the early 14th century. While these changes were gradual, they contributed to a slow but steady improvement in agricultural resilience over the centuries. 9. Shifts in settlement patterns. In regions repeatedly struck by famine, settlement patterns could change entirely. Isolated hamlets were more likely to be abandoned, with survivors moving to larger, more centralized villages where mutual aid networks were stronger and market access was better. Some peasants relocated to towns permanently, drawn by wage labor opportunities and the security of urban food markets. Over time, this migration contributed to the slow but significant growth of medieval towns. 10. Collective memory and storytelling. For those who lived through famine, the memories lingered long after the fields turned green again. Stories of the hungry years were passed down to children and grandchildren, both as warnings and as cultural touchstones. These tales preserve the lessons of endurance, generosity, and preparedness, shaping how future generations approached hardship. Some of these accounts survive in medieval chronicles, which describe not only the suffering but also the acts of courage and kindness that occurred amid the scarcity. For villagers, famine became part of a shared history, a reference point for understanding both the dangers of the world and the resilience of their community. Conclusion: medieval famine was more than a temporary lack of food. It was a force that reshaped the demographic, economic, and social landscape. It tested the bonds of community, forced innovations in survival strategies, and left lasting marks on the memory of those who endured it. For the medieval peasant, the end of famine was not a return to normal life, but the beginning of a long process of recovery, one that could take years, even decades. And in the back of everyone's mind was the knowledge that the next bad harvest could come at any time. In the next section, we'll shift our focus from famine to the peasant's role in medieval trade networks, exploring how rural households connected with local markets, fairs, and long-distance commerce. When we think of medieval peasants, it's easy to picture them living entirely off the land they worked, producing everything they needed and rarely leaving their villages. While self-sufficiency was certainly important, the reality was far more interconnected. Even the humblest household participated, directly or indirectly, in a web of trade that stretched from local marketplaces to distant regions. Trade was the lifeblood that allowed medieval communities to supplement their needs, sell surpluses, and gain access to goods that could never be produced locally. 1. The local market as a weekly ritual for most peasants. The first and most regular point of contact with trade was the local market. Many towns and large villages held weekly market days, often on a fixed day that was granted by a charter from the king or a local lord. On market day, peasants might travel on foot or by cart to sell small surpluses, eggs, butter, cheese, surplus vegetables, or surplus grain. Others brought live chickens, geese, or even pigs. In exchange, they could purchase salt, fish, cloth, metal tools, or other goods not produced in their village. The market was more than an economic exchange. It was a social event. Gossip, court proceedings, and the latest news from neighboring villages all mingled with the smell of fresh bread, roasting meat, and livestock pens. 2. The role of seasonal fairs beyond the weekly market. Many peasants also attended seasonal fairs. These were larger gatherings, often tied to religious festivals, that attracted traders from far and wide. The goods on offer at a fair could be dazzling compared to the modest selection of the local market. Imported fabrics, exotic spices, fine pottery, and even small luxury items like glass beads or colored thread. For peasants, fairs were opportunities not just to buy and sell, but to see a wider world. The presence of merchants from distant towns or even other countries gave these events a cosmopolitan flavor that contrasted sharply with the routines of rural life. 3. Barter and the limited use of money while coinage circulated in medieval Europe. Many small transactions still operated through barter, especially in rural areas where cash could be scarce. A peasant might trade a measure of barley for a sack of salt or exchange a fattened goose for a new iron pot. Even when coins were used, the amounts were often tiny. A copper penny could buy small necessities, and larger silver coins might only be handled occasionally. Gold coins were rare in the hands of peasants and were usually seen only in the context of paying rents or taxes to lords. 4. Obligations to the lord and the manor. It's important to remember that not all goods a peasant produced could be freely traded. On many manors, part of the harvest, known as boon work or feudal dues, was owed to the lord. Some lords also maintained a monopoly over certain trades, requiring peasants to use the lord's mill, bakehouse, or winepress for a fee. This meant that peasants had to navigate a careful balance between fulfilling their obligations and setting aside goods for personal sale or barter. 5. Goods flowing into the village trade was not just about what peasants sold. It was also about what came in. Salt, one of the most critical imports, was essential for preserving meat through the winter. Fish, both fresh and salted, was another common import, especially in inland villages where it could be a rare treat. Metal goods such as plowshares, knives, hinges, and nails almost always came from outside, as village smiths could only produce certain items. Cloth, whether woolen or linen, was also often purchased in the market, though some households spun and wove their own. 6. Traveling peddlers and hawkers. Not all trade required peasants to travel. In some areas, peddlers, often called chapmen, visited villages, carrying goods in packs or pushing small carts. These mobile merchants brought items like sewing needles, ribbons, small mirrors, or combs, objects that were both useful and, in some cases, luxuries. Peddlers played a key role in connecting isolated communities with regional trade networks. They might also act as news carriers, spreading information between towns and villages. 7. Surplus as the gateway to trade for most peasants. The ability to engage in trade depended on producing more than they consumed. This surplus could come from an unusually good harvest, specialized skills, such as basket weaving or pottery, or the raising of livestock for sale. Some households became known for producing certain goods in small quantities, a type of early rural specialization. A skilled thatcher might find steady work in nearby villages, while a family good at brewing ale might sell extra barrels at market. 8. Risks and rewards of selling in town. For peasants living far from market towns, traveling to sell goods was not without risk. Roads could be dangerous, and transporting goods, especially livestock, was hard work. Bad weather could spoil perishable items before they were sold. However, the rewards could be significant. Town markets often offered better prices than small village exchanges, and the variety of goods available was far greater. Some peasants became adept at timing their trips to coincide with high-demand periods, such as Lent, when fish sold well, or harvest season, when tools and grain were in demand. 9. Peasants as consumers, not just producers. It's a mistake to think peasants were uninterested in buying goods beyond bare necessities. Many invested in better clothing, household utensils, or even small luxuries when they could afford them. A fine wooden chest, a painted ceramic jug, or a brightly dyed headscarf could be both a source of pride and a symbol of modest prosperity. These purchases were not only about comfort, they could also serve as savings. Durable goods could be pawned or sold in hard times, functioning as a form of economic security. 10. Integration into wider trade networks. Even if an individual peasant never traveled beyond their village, the goods they consumed often had long and complex journeys. Salt might come from coastal pans hundreds of miles away. Wool from their sheep might eventually be sold to merchants who exported it across the Channel to Flanders. This interconnectedness meant that even rural communities were affected by broader market fluctuations, political changes, and trade disputes. A war between kingdoms could disrupt the flow of salt. A poor fishing season could raise the price of herring, and changes in foreign demand could influence local wool prices. Conclusion of Part 1. Trade was a constant thread in the life of the medieval peasant, not daily, but woven into the rhythm of the seasons. From the weekly market to the annual fair, from the peddler's pack to the distant merchant's ship, these exchanges shaped not only what peasants ate in war, but also how they interacted with the wider medieval world. In the next part, we'll explore the infrastructure that supported peasant trade: roads, rivers, bridges, and toll systems, and how these could both enable and restrict rural commerce. If trade was the lifeblood of medieval rural life, then the transport routes were its arteries. The movement of goods, people, and information depended on a patchwork of roads, rivers, bridges, and coastal routes. Some ancient, others hastily constructed or poorly maintained. For peasants, the condition and accessibility of these routes could mean the difference between a profitable trip to market and a wasted, back-breaking journey. 1. Roads. From Roman relics to muddy tracks in parts of Europe once under Roman rule. Some ancient stone roads still existed, remarkably durable despite centuries of wear. These were the exception. Most medieval roads were little more than dirt tracks that became rutted and muddy in wet weather and dusty in summer. For rural peasants, the most common routes were hollow ways, sunken paths formed by centuries of foot traffic, carts, and livestock. These could become impassable in winter when deep mud turned them into quagmires. Travelers often had to plan trips around the weather, knowing that heavy rains might delay or cancel a journey altogether. 2. Bridges and fords, rivers and streams were both obstacles and lifelines for trade. In many places, the only way to cross was at a shallow ford. These were risky, especially in spring when snowmelt or rain swelled the water, and carts could be damaged or washed away. Bridges were precious infrastructure, often built and maintained by local lords, monasteries, or towns. Some were wooden and needed frequent repair. Others, made of stone, could last for centuries. However, crossing a bridge often meant paying a toll. 3. Tolls and road fees. Tolls were a fact of life for anyone moving goods over long distances. Lords, bishops, and town authorities all claimed the right to charge travelers for using certain roads, bridges, or gates. Peasants might pay in coin or kind, such as a portion of their goods. These fees could significantly cut into profits, meaning that peasants had to factor toll costs into their decisions about where and when to trade. While tolls were unpopular, they were justified by authorities as necessary for road and bridge maintenance, though in practice, funds were often diverted elsewhere. 4. Pack animals and carts. The way goods were transported depended on both the route and the wealth of the peasant. For short distances, goods could be carried by hand or in a simple handcart. Longer journeys often required a cart pulled by oxen or horses. Oxen were stronger and cheaper to feed but slower. Horses were faster but more expensive to keep. In hilly areas or where roads were poor, pack animals such as mules or donkeys were preferred, as they could navigate narrow paths more easily than carts. 5. River transport. The medieval highways, wherever navigable rivers existed, they were the most efficient means of moving goods. A boat could carry many times the load of a cart, and water transport was often faster and less physically demanding. Many towns and monasteries were located along rivers for precisely this reason. Grain, wool, and timber could be floated downstream, while salt, wine, and fish could be brought in from coastal ports or larger towns upstream. Of course, river transport wasn't free. Ferrymen charged to move people and carts across, and river tolls were levied in certain stretches. In some places, lords controlled key bends or narrows in a river and charged passage fees, sometimes so high they became notorious among merchants. 6. Coastal and overseas routes for communities near the sea. Coastal trade was an important supplement to inland markets. Small fishing boats could be used to transport goods along the coast, while larger vessels carried bulk cargo between ports. Peasants rarely engaged directly in overseas trade, but goods they bought, salted fish from the North Sea, wine from France, or olive oil from the Mediterranean, might arrive via ships. These were typically purchased from merchants in town markets or fairs. 7. The role of monasteries in trade infrastructure. Monasteries were surprisingly important players in maintaining infrastructure. Many owned large estates and had both the resources and the incentive to keep roads, bridges, and river crossings in good repair. Some monasteries even offered lodging for travelers, acting as safe rest points for merchants and peasants alike. This hospitality was partly charitable and partly practical, ensuring that pilgrims, traders, and church officials could travel more easily. 8. Hazards along the way. Travel in the medieval world was not just slow, it could be dangerous. Bandits were a constant threat, especially in wooded or isolated stretches of road. In times of war or unrest, raiding soldiers could also target travelers. For this reason, peasants often traveled in groups for safety. A few families might coordinate trips to market together, both to share cart space and to deter potential attackers. In winter, icy conditions made roads treacherous, while in spring, swollen rivers could cut off entire regions. A missed market due to bad conditions might mean going without needed goods for weeks or months. 9. Seasonal rhythms of transport. The rhythm of peasant trade was tied to the agricultural calendar. After planting in spring or harvesting in autumn, there was more time for long journeys to markets or fairs. Some goods were inherently seasonal: fresh produce in summer, wool after shearing, salted meats in winter. Certain roads and river routes were more accessible in specific months, influencing when and where peasants could sell their goods. 10. Innovation and improvement over time. Though medieval infrastructure often seems primitive compared to Roman engineering or later developments, there were gradual improvements. Stone bridges replaced wooden ones. Some lords invested in better road surfacing, and river navigation was improved with locks and cleared channels. By the late Middle Ages, as trade expanded and towns grew richer, there was increasing pressure to improve transport routes, not just for merchants, but for the peasants whose produce fed the urban population. Conclusion of Part 2. The infrastructure of roads, bridges, and waterways shaped the possibilities of peasant trade. Even with the challenges of poor maintenance, tolls, and seasonal hazards, these networks connected rural villages to the broader economy of medieval Europe. In the next part, we'll examine the impact of trade on peasant society, how it influenced wealth distribution, social mobility, and even cultural exchange in the countryside. While the practical realities of transport and markets shaped the mechanics of trade, its social and cultural consequences in medieval villages were equally profound. Trade was not just an exchange of goods, it was an exchange of opportunity, influence, and even ideas. 1. Economic impact. Beyond subsistence in the most basic sense, trade allowed peasants to move beyond subsistence farming. While the majority still relied on their own production for daily needs, selling surplus crops or crafted goods could generate extra income. That income could be reinvested in better tools, livestock, or seeds, creating a small but important cycle of improvement. Some peasants might save enough to lease additional strips of land, increasing their output and standing in the community. However, the benefits of trade were uneven. Wealthier peasants with surplus to sell could participate more actively and profitably, while poorer peasants, whose harvest barely fed their own families, had little to gain from market exchange. 2. Specialization and craftsmanship. Trade encouraged specialization. A peasant with skill in carpentry, blacksmithing, or weaving could supplement agricultural work with crafts that fetched good prices in markets. In some villages, a few families became known for particular products: sturdy wooden barrels, fine linen, or well-crafted harnesses. These goods might travel far beyond the local market via traders and merchants, creating reputations that lasted for generations. Specialization also fostered interdependence among villages. One community might be known for its wool, another for pottery, and another for salted fish, creating networks of exchange that tied rural areas together. 3. Social mobility. Rare, but real for a small number of peasants, trade could open the door to modest social mobility. Successful traders might accumulate enough wealth to buy their own freedom if they were serfs, lease more land, or even move into a nearby town. Some families shifted over generations from pure subsistence farming to becoming full-time artisans or merchants. This was not common. Feudal obligations and the risks of trade limited upward movement, but it was possible. 4. Dependence on external goods. Trade also created dependencies. Items like salt, iron tools, and certain fabrics could not be produced locally in many areas. Without access to trade routes and markets, villages risked shortages of these essentials. In times of war, plague, or political unrest, when roads became unsafe or markets were disrupted, such dependencies could become dangerous. Peasants might have to rely on inferior substitutes or go without entirely. 5. The role of women in trade. Women played a significant role in peasant trade, though their contributions are often underrepresented in surviving records. Wives and daughters frequently managed the sale of dairy products, eggs, poultry, and garden produce in local markets. In some cases, widows took over their late husband's market stalls or small trading businesses. Women were also key players in cottage industries like spinning, brewing, and bread baking, selling surplus for extra income. 6. Cultural exchange and news markets were not only economic hubs but also social and cultural crossroads. Peasants heard news from other villages, towns, and even distant lands, brought by traveling merchants, pilgrims, and itinerant craftsmen. This flow of information could include political developments, rumors of war, tales of far-off places, and new agricultural techniques. Even in isolated villages, such news created a faint but real awareness of a wider world beyond the fields. 7. Market regulations and fair practices. To maintain order and fairness, markets were often regulated by local authorities. Officials might inspect goods, enforce standard weights and measures, and punish fraud. While intended to protect buyers and sellers, these regulations also reinforced the authority of the local lord or town council. Violations could result in fines, public humiliation, or confiscation of goods. 8. The influence of the church. The church also played a role in shaping peasant trade. Many markets and fairs were timed to coincide with religious festivals, ensuring large gatherings of people. The churchyard or land near monasteries was often the site of these events. Clergy sometimes preached against dishonest trading practices, while monasteries themselves engaged in extensive trade. In some cases, Church authorities banned certain activities on holy days, which could limit trade opportunities. 9. Seasonal and annual fairs. While weekly markets were crucial for everyday goods, annual fairs were major events that brought a burst of economic and social activity to rural life. Fairs attracted merchants from far away, offering exotic goods that most peasants rarely saw, such as fine cloth, spices, or luxury pottery. They also featured entertainment, musicians, acrobats, storytellers, and tournaments. For peasants, attending a fair was both a chance to sell surplus produce and to experience a rare break from the routine of agricultural work. 10. Tensions and conflicts over trade could also spark tensions. Competition for the best market stalls, disputes over prices, or accusations of dishonest weights sometimes led to fights. Relations between peasants and merchants were not always harmonious. Peasants might resent high prices for goods they couldn't produce themselves, while merchants might see peasants as unreliable suppliers. In some cases, lords attempted to restrict trade to their own markets, forbidding peasants from selling goods elsewhere. Such restrictions were often deeply unpopular, as they reduced competition and drove down the prices peasants could earn. Conclusion of Section 7 for medieval peasants. Trade was both an opportunity and a risk. It offered the possibility of extra income, new goods, and broader connections, but it also tied them to larger economic forces beyond their control. The rhythms of trade, shaped by seasons, markets, fairs, and transport routes, wove rural villages into the economic fabric of medieval Europe. Even in the smallest hamlets, the pull of the marketplace was felt in the cycles of planting and harvest, in the tools in the shed, and in the rare but memorable trips beyond the village boundaries. In the next section, we'll turn to medieval peasant leisure and festivals, examining how, despite the grind of agricultural life, moments of joy, community, and celebration broke the monotony of work. For a medieval peasant, survival was not a solitary endeavor but a shared responsibility woven into the fabric of daily life. The village was a living organism, where each person's labor, skill, and resilience formed part of a collective shield against the many hardships that could strike without warning. Neighbors did not merely live side by side. They depended on one another in ways that modern communities rarely require. When a family's roof collapsed under heavy snow, others came with thatch and timber, not out of charity alone, but from the understanding that next time, it might be their own roof that needed mending. When sickness swept through a household, women from nearby homes would take turns bringing broth, tending fires, or watching children, even while quietly fearing that the same illness might soon come for them. These bonds were not limited to emergencies. Planting season was a communal affair, with long days in the fields spent side by side, hands blistered from the hoe, backs aching in unison. The same held true for harvest, when time was short and every able-bodied men, women, and children joined in to gather the grain before rain could ruin it. Songs often rose over the fields, not as entertainment but as a rhythm to keep the work going and spirits steady. In such a world, no one could truly afford the luxury of isolation. A quarrel with a neighbor could mean losing help when your own crops failed or your livestock wandered off. Faith played a binding role as well. The church stood at the village's heart, both physically and spiritually, and attendance was less about individual devotion than about reinforcing the collective identity. Festivals, saints' days, and processions brought everyone together in shared ritual, marking the passage of time and the cycles of labor. Even in times of grief, funerals were community events, offering not only prayers for the departed but also comfort for the living in the form of food, shared stories, and the quiet reminder that life carried on. Such interdependence did not erase hardship, but it softened its edges. When war threatened, villagers might build defensive ditches or wooden palisades together, pooling whatever meager resources they could muster. When famine loomed, food was stretched by sharing meals in larger households, ensuring that the weakest, children, the elderly, the sick, had a chance to endure. There was no romantic illusion about the difficulties of life. People knew that help given today might be repaid tomorrow, or it might never be repaid at all. Yet in the eyes of the peasant, this was simply the way life worked. Survival was a thread spun from countless acts of cooperation, trust, and mutual need, each as essential as the food on the table or the shelter overhead. When sickness crept into the village, it rarely announced itself with a single cough or fever. It came like a shadow lengthening across the fields, quietly but steadily, until everyone could feel its presence. The change was often first noticed at the well, where there had been the usual chatter, voices discussing weather, harvest, or gossip. There was now a hush, a stiffness, as people kept a little more distance than usual. Mothers drew water quickly and hurried their children home, avoiding lingering. The fear was subtle at first, but it grew fast, tightening around the village like a cord. No one knew exactly how illness traveled. Some believed it came with the winds from faraway lands, carrying invisible poisons that slipped into lungs. Others said it rose from the damp soil after too much rain, the earth exhaling foul vapors that poisoned the air. A few whispered that disease was God's punishment for unconfessed sins, and that repentance was the only cure. Whatever the reason, one truth remained. When sickness struck, life in the village changed overnight. Daily routines faltered. Fields that needed tending were left half plowed. Sheep grazed unattended in distant meadows. Bread ovens went cold because the baker had fallen ill. The absence of labor was more than an inconvenience. It was a danger. If the planting was delayed, there would be less to harvest. If the livestock wandered too far, they could be lost to wolves or thieves. Each person's work was a thread in a fragile web, and when enough threads broke, the whole thing risked collapsing. And yet, even in the face of danger, there were always a few who stepped forward to care for the sick. They brought herbal infusions made from yarrow, sage, or elderflower, believing these could draw out the fever. They laid damp cloths on sweating foreheads, spooned broth into cracked lips, or sat by the bedside through the night, whispering psalms or telling stories to keep fear at bay. Often, these caregivers understood the risk. They had seen others fall ill after tending to the sick, but the bond of kinship or friendship outweighed self-preservation. In small villages, where everyone's lives were tightly woven together, abandoning the sick was unthinkable for many. Not every community reacted with the same courage. In some places, terror won. Doors were barred from the outside, and food was left at thresholds to avoid direct contact. Houses were marked so that strangers knew to keep away. Sometimes the sick were sent to huts on the edge of the village, tended from a distance until they recovered or passed on. It was a harsh measure, but for some, It was the only way they believed they could protect the many from the fate of the few. These choices left lasting marks, not just on those who survived, but on the memory of the community itself. Stories would be told for years afterward about who had shown mercy and who had turned away. Even in calmer times, health was a shared responsibility. Villagers carried a collective knowledge of remedies that had been tested not in books but in countless kitchens and fields. If someone's stomach was in knots, they might be offered mint leaves steeped in warm water. A cough could be treated with honey mixed with crushed garlic. Bruises were smeared with a poultice made from plantain leaves, and cuts were cleaned with boiled water infused with rosemary. These treatments were as much ritual as medicine, repeated because they had been handed down for generations and because they offered a sense of action against the unknown. Superstition was woven tightly into these practices. A charm tied with red thread around the wrist was believed to ward off fevers. A sprig of rowan placed above the door kept away sickness. Some would burn juniper or rosemary in the hearth, letting the smoke curl through the house to chase away invisible spirits of illness. Outsiders might have dismissed these customs as nonsense, but for the villagers, they were part of a larger tapestry of belief that gave them the courage to face the uncertainties of life. There was comfort in knowing that, when sickness came, one would not face it entirely alone. This reassurance was perhaps the most powerful medicine of all. Even when fear was strong, the knowledge that someone would bring water, light the fire, or simply sit nearby could make the difference between despair and endurance. In the hardest moments, the village's survival depended less on the strength of individuals than on the invisible bonds that held them together. Those bonds, woven from years of shared labor, shared meals, and shared dangers, were what kept the community from breaking apart when the shadow of illness passed overhead. In this way, disease was not only an enemy but also a test. It revealed the true nature of the ties between neighbors and families. It could drive people apart, or it could forge them closer together. And though cures were rare and often unreliable, the persistence of care, the refusal to let the sick vanish into isolation, was its own kind of victory, one that allowed the village to carry on into the next season, battered but unbroken. When the worst of an illness finally began to loosen its grip, it was never a sudden victory. There was no single moment when someone declared that the danger had passed. Instead, it was noticed in small, almost unremarkable ways. A cough that had rattled the walls for days would fade into silence. The smoke from the baker's chimney would curl into the morning air again. A child, pale but smiling, might be seen sitting in the doorway, blinking at the sun after long days spent indoors. These were quiet signs that life, fragile but persistent, was returning to its old rhythm. The relief, however, was always mixed with caution. People knew that sickness could return without warning. In the days after an outbreak, the village moved as if on tiptoe. Visitors were still kept at arm's length, and gatherings were smaller, quieter. Tools and utensils that had been used in sick rooms were cleaned thoroughly, sometimes washed in strong-smelling vinegar or passed through smoke. Fires were kept burning in the hearth not only for warmth but as a shield. Smoke was thought to cleanse the air, to drive away lingering poison. Food played a central role in recovery. Those who had been sick were given light broths first, rich with onions, leeks, and herbs that were believed to restore strength. When their appetite returned, they were offered fresh bread, goat's milk, and small portions of roasted meat if it was available. Every mouthful was a step toward normality, and the sharing of food was a reassurance that the sick were once again part of the community's circle. But recovery was not only physical. Illness left scars on the mind. Children who had seen neighbors taken away in silence might grow more watchful, more hesitant to play far from home. Adults, too, carried the memory of those empty chairs at the table, the voices they would never hear again. These memories could linger for years, quietly shaping the way people spoke of health, fate, and the will of God. Some believed that these losses were warnings, reminders to live humbly, to keep one's soul clean, for life could be taken without notice. Season after season, the experience of sickness became part of the village's unspoken knowledge. Old women would recall, in the year the fever came, the harvest was poor, but we managed with rye bread and apples. Men would nod and add, we lost fewer that time because we kept to our houses and burned more juniper. These were not lessons written down in books, but they were remembered and passed on with the same care as planting times or weather signs. In this way, each new outbreak was met with a little more preparation, a little more determination to endure. There were moments, too, when the village found unexpected strength in hardship. A neighbor who had once been aloof might begin helping with the harvest after seeing others tend to his family in their sickness. Rivalries could dissolve, if only for a while, replaced by a sense of shared survival. Bonds that had been frayed were sometimes rewoven stronger than before. These changes did not always last, human nature being what it was, but during the weeks and months after an illness, a quieter kindness often lingered in the air. Religious observance often deepened after recovery. The church became a place not just of worship but of thanksgiving. Families who had been spared might bring offerings, loaves of bread, a sack of grain, or candles to burn for the souls of the lost. Priests would lead special prayers asking for protection from future outbreaks, their voices echoing through stone walls still cool from the night. For many, it was important to mark the passing of danger with ceremony, to place their survival in the hands of something greater than themselves. Life eventually resumed its familiar patterns. Fields were plowed again, markets reopened, and children's laughter began to ring through the lanes. But the village was never quite the same as it had been before. Each wave of sickness carved its mark, altering the way people saw the world and their place in it. There was a sharper awareness of life's fragility, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the ordinary days when the sun rose over healthy fields and every face at the table was present. This cycle, illness, fear, endurance, and recovery, was one that every generation knew, and each learned to navigate in their own way. It was not a tale of grand battles or heroic conquests, but of quiet resilience, of people holding to one another through the slow, grinding trials of everyday survival. And though the memory of each sickness would fade into the background of daily life, it never disappeared entirely. It lingered like the faint crack in a wall after a storm, barely noticed most days, but always there, a reminder of what had passed and what could return. Surviving famine in a medieval village was never a matter of a single clever trick or one person's strength. It was a slow, grinding ordeal that tested every layer of the community. Hunger did not descend overnight. It crept in quietly, first noticed when the flour bins grew light earlier in the season than they should have, or when the sheep were slaughtered earlier than planned because fodder was running low. Whispers would pass through the market that the next harvest might not come in time, that the weather had been too cold, too wet, or too dry for the crops to thrive. These whispers, at first, were easy to dismiss, until they weren't. The first sign of real trouble was when bread became thinner, its loaves stretched with ground-up acorns, pea husks, or chaff. Families began setting aside the best grains for planting next season, a gamble that meant eating less today in the hope of food tomorrow. Meat, already a rare luxury for peasants, all but vanished from their tables, except for the occasional small bird trapped in the hedgerows or a rabbit caught in a snare. Dinners became bowls of thin pottage, a watery stew of whatever roots, herbs, and scraps could be found. For the poorest, the search for food turned outward into the wild. Men, women, and even children scoured the edges of fields and forests for anything edible. Nettles, wild garlic, mushrooms, and berries if the season allowed. Roots were dug from the earth and boiled to soften their bitterness. Some plants, though, were dangerous if prepared poorly, and stories circulated of families who had eaten the wrong thing in desperation. Survival meant knowing not only what could be eaten, but how to make it safe. In the early weeks, those with more resources, small landowners, merchants, or better-off farmers, would quietly help their poorer neighbors. A sack of barley might be lent on the promise it would be repaid after the next harvest. But as weeks turned to months and the shortage deepened, even the well-off began to tighten their belts. Grain stores were locked, and the sight of someone guarding their barn with a pitchfork was not uncommon. Trust could fray quickly under the strain of an empty stomach. Yet famine did not always strip away kindness. In some villages, the church became the heart of relief efforts. Monks and nuns, or the parish priest, might open the church's stores, handing out bread or bowls of gruel to the most desperate. Some parishes kept poor gardens. Small plots tended to feed those who had nothing. These acts could mean the difference between life and death for many, though supplies were rarely enough to feed everyone fully. The lords, too, played a complicated role. In the best cases, a lord might lower rents, open his own granaries, or provide work in exchange for food, repairing walls, digging ditches, or tending livestock. But there were also lords who tightened their demands, insisting on rents and tithes even as their peasants starved. In such places, resentment could simmer dangerously. Hunger has a way of eroding fear, and history held quiet stories of desperate men taking more than they were given. Despite the hardship, people found ways to stretch what little they had. Bread was baked less often to save fuel, and the dough was sometimes left to ferment longer, making it feel heavier and more filling. Pottage could be thickened with beans or peas, which stored better than grain. Salted fish, if it could be obtained, was treasured not just for its taste, but for its ability to keep hunger at bay longer than a bowl of greens. Even small tricks, like eating slowly or sharing a single loaf over 2 days instead of one, were part of the art of survival. Children suffered most in these times. Their growth slowed, their cheeks hollowed, and their play grew quieter. Mothers sometimes went without so their children could have a little more. In return, older children worked alongside the adults, helping in the fields, tending animals, or foraging, because every pair of hands could make a difference. Hunger was a teacher, and it taught early. As the famine stretched on, hope often clung to the sky. Every patch of cloud, every shift in the wind, was read for signs of change. If the rains came too late, or the frost struck early, the year's work could be lost. And so, prayers became more fervent. In some villages, processions were held, lines of villagers walking the fields, chanting for divine mercy. Bells were rung to drive away ill fortune. In the minds of many, famine was not just bad luck, it was a test, or even a punishment, and it needed to be met with both endurance and repentance. The hardest truth was that famine did not end with the first green shoots of spring. Even if the fields promised a good harvest, those months between planting and reaping were still dangerous. The hungry gap, as it was known, could claim as many lives as the famine's first peak. But still, people endured. They planted, they foraged, they shared what they could, and they waited for the day when the grain would be threshed and the smell of fresh bread would once again fill the air. When famine lingered beyond a single season, it began to reshape the very fabric of village life. The rhythms that had governed the community for generations, seed time and harvest, feast days and market days, were interrupted by a constant preoccupation with survival. Instead of planning for the future, people lived from day to day, and the bonds that held neighbors together were tested in ways both subtle and severe. Old debts suddenly mattered less than immediate hunger, and promises made in better times were broken when the choice came down to keeping one's word or keeping one's children alive. In some places, famine hardened the lines between classes. Lords and wealthy landholders might protect their own households first, feeding retainers and close kin before peasants. The poor, unable to pay rent or fulfill labor obligations, sometimes abandoned their strips of land entirely, moving in search of work or food elsewhere. This exodus could leave entire villages half empty, their fields overgrown and houses falling into disrepair. The loss of labor in turn made recovery harder when good weather finally returned, creating a vicious cycle that could take years to break. But there were also instances where hardship drew people closer together. Shared suffering could forge alliances across social boundaries, if only temporarily. A well-off farmer might share seed grain with his poorer neighbors, knowing that a healthy harvest next year would benefit the whole community. Women often organized informal networks to care for one another's children, pooling what little food they had so that no child went entirely without. These acts of solidarity did not erase the pain of famine, but they planted seeds of trust that could outlast the crisis. The church remained central to the moral and practical response to famine. Parish priests urged patience and piety, often interpreting the famine as divine chastisement for sins, whether greed, neglect of the poor, or failure to honor the holy days. Special masses were held, with prayers for rain or for the lifting of pestilence that might have afflicted the crops. Some churches opened their alms chests, distributing coin or food to the destitute. Monastic communities sometimes fared better in times of scarcity, thanks to their larger and better managed estates, and could provide a modest safety net for the surrounding countryside. Yet even monasteries could be overwhelmed when too many hungry mouths arrived at their gates. As scarcity deepened, alternative economies sprang up. People traded goods and services that might otherwise have seemed inconsequential. A handful of eggs could be exchanged for a small loaf, or a day's labor in the fields for a pot of barley stew. Skills like weaving, mending tools, or making candles took on new value, since they could be bartered for sustenance. This barter system bypassed the usual market stalls and formal exchanges, turning kitchens, barns, and even crossroads into places of quiet trade. Inevitably, not all responses to famine were noble. Theft became more common, sometimes petty. A loaf of bread taken from a windowsill, a chicken lifted from a co-op. but sometimes far more dangerous. Grain stores were raided under cover of night, and there were occasional violent clashes when thieves were caught in the act. In some cases, desperation drove people to poach on the Lord's lands, risking harsh punishments for a few rabbits or fish. The penalties could be severe, but hunger often outweighed fear. The psychological toll of famine was harder to measure than the physical one. Yet it was no less real. People grew wary of one another, watching neighbors for signs of hoarding. Rumors spread quickly of secret stores hidden under floorboards, of dishonest millers cheating their customers, of merchants watering down ale or stretching flour with inedible fillers. Trust, once lost, could take years to rebuild. And in villages where famine struck repeatedly, a kind of fatalism sometimes took root, dulling people's willingness to invest in long-term plans or improvements. Children carried the memory of famine into adulthood, and it shaped the choices they made for the rest of their lives. Those who survived often learned to store food obsessively, to keep extra seed hidden, or to diversify their crops to avoid future disaster. Oral histories passed down through families kept the memory alive, cautionary tales about wastefulness, warnings about relying too heavily on a single harvest. These lessons, however hard-won, became part of the cultural fabric. Even when the rains returned and the fields turned green again, famine left its mark on the land itself. Overgrazed commons might take years to recover. Fields left fallow out of necessity grew thick with weeds. Tools broken during the hardest times might remain unrepaired for want of iron or skilled smiths. And for every family that had survived, there were others who had vanished, their cottages empty, their names fading from memory. When the first harvest after a famine finally came in, it was more than a relief. It was a cause for celebration that could rival a wedding or a great feast day. The baking of the first loaves, the smell of fresh grain being ground, the sound of laughter returning to the marketplace. These were the signs that the worst had passed, but no one forgot how close they had come to the edge, and the fear of hunger never fully disappeared. It lingered in the way people counted their stores, in the way they measured each season's harvest against the last, and in the unspoken knowledge that, no matter how good the year was, another famine could always come. In the wake of famine, recovery was neither swift nor simple. The first year of renewed abundance often felt like a fragile gift, one that could vanish again with a single bad season. Farmers approached the new planting with both relief and caution, spreading their seed across different plots to hedge against failure. Those who had lost oxen during the lean years found themselves breaking the soil by hand, slowing the work and forcing them to sow less than they might have before. Some land lay unused simply because there were not enough healthy people left to work it. Markets, too, took time to recover. Merchants who had survived the famine often raised prices at first, not out of greed alone, but to rebuild their own losses. The scarcity of certain goods, iron for tools, salt for preserving meat, even the cloth for making sacks, meant that barter and improvisation remained common for years after. In some towns, new regulations were passed to prevent hoarding, but enforcement was uneven, depending on the will of local officials and the cooperation of the community. Villages that had suffered the worst losses sometimes invited settlers from elsewhere to take over abandoned plots, offering favorable rents or reduced obligations to entice them. These newcomers brought fresh skills, different farming techniques, and sometimes even new crops, subtly reshaping the local economy. In a few places, such migrations gave rise to tensions between old residents and new, as customs clashed and land boundaries were disputed. But just as often, the shared work of rebuilding forged new bonds. The cultural memory of famine lived on in seasonal rituals. In some regions, small portions of the first harvest were set aside and given to the poor before anyone else took from the storehouses, a symbolic repayment for the aid received in harder times, or perhaps an offering to divine powers to ensure continued favor. Folk songs and tales wove famine into their verses, warning listeners against wastefulness or reminding them of the virtues of patience and mutual care. The church played a role in this recovery phase as well, encouraging charity and sometimes organizing communal granaries. These granaries served as a safeguard. In years of good yield, a small portion of grain was stored away under lock and key to be distributed in lean years. It was not a perfect system. Poor management or outright theft could still deplete the stores, but it represented a conscious attempt to learn from past suffering. Children who had been small during the famine grew up hearing stories of the hardships they themselves could not clearly remember. Parents and grandparents recounted how neighbors had shared or withheld food, how some had faced punishment for theft while others had been praised for generosity. These stories shaped the moral landscape of the next generation. They learned that survival was never guaranteed, and that cooperation could be as important as individual effort. Yet famine also left scars in the social order. In some communities, the rich had grown richer by buying up land from desperate neighbors during the worst years, consolidating their holdings. These changes in ownership could alter village politics for decades, shifting influence toward those who had weathered the famine best. At the same time, communities that had worked closely together during the crisis sometimes emerged with a stronger sense of unity, having proven to themselves that they could endure hardship collectively. Nature, too, bore the marks of famine. Forest edges might have crept back over abandoned fields, while wildlife populations fluctuated in response to changes in hunting and grazing pressure. Rivers and irrigation channels, left untended, silted up or overgrew with reeds. Bringing the land fully back into productive use often required as much labor and planning as the initial clearing had generations earlier. Perhaps the greatest legacy of famine was the way it altered people's relationship to risk. Those who had survived tended to diversify their livelihoods whenever possible. A farmer might keep a small flock of sheep alongside his grain fields, or plant both hardy barley and more delicate wheat to avoid total loss. Families might keep a small kitchen garden for herbs and vegetables, ensuring at least some fresh food even if the main harvest failed. Others found ways to store or preserve food more effectively, salting fish, drying fruit, or keeping root vegetables in cool cellars, so that a surplus in one season could carry them through the next. The memory of famine also influenced politics. Local leaders who had been seen as fair and generous during the crisis often retained their positions for many years, while those accused of selfishness or incompetence found their authority challenged. In some cases, the trauma of famine pushed communities to petition higher authorities, lords, kings, or councils, for greater protection, fairer taxes, or investment in infrastructure like mills and irrigation. While such petitions were not always granted, they reflected a growing awareness that survival depended not only on the whims of weather, but also on the structures of society. Over time, the story of a famine would shift from living memory into history. Details blurred. Numbers of the dead became estimates, and the harshest moments were sometimes softened in the telling. But the lessons endured. Each new generation inherited a caution that shaped how they farmed, stored food, and related to their neighbors. They knew that plenty was never permanent, and that prudence was the best defense against hunger. And so, even in years of abundance, the shadow of famine stretched quietly across the fields, an unspoken reminder that the earth's generosity could not be taken for granted. People had learned, in the hardest possible way, that resilience was not born from hope alone. It was built from memory, preparation, and the bonds that held a community together when the granaries were empty and the winter winds blew cold. The end of the famine did not mean the end of struggle, for recovery was always uneven and life in the countryside remained tied to the fragile balance between human effort and nature's will. The years that followed were marked by a cautious optimism, but also by a constant undercurrent of vigilance. Villages had been reshaped not only by loss of life, but by the shifting of land, labor, and trust. Old family lines had been broken. Marriages between survivors from different parishes were more common now, binding communities together in new ways. It was not unusual to meet a farmer tilling a plot once worked by a family entirely gone, the memory of their absence lingering like a shadow over the furrows. Trade routes, once interrupted by hunger and instability, slowly came alive again. Merchants returned to the roads, their carts laden with goods from distant towns, wool from the hills, fish from the coast, spices brought through the hands of countless intermediaries. The sight of a market bustling again was a reassurance, yet the memory of scarcity kept buyers and sellers wary. People had learned to keep back a portion of their goods, hidden or stored away, for no one could be certain when disaster might strike again. In towns and larger villages, the rhythm of public life began to regain its strength. Church bells rang for weddings, not just funerals. Seasonal fairs drew crowds once more, with traveling entertainers, hawkers, and fortune-tellers filling the air with noise and color. For a brief moment, people allowed themselves to forget the lean years, though no one truly forgot. The famine was always there, in the pauses between laughter, in the unspoken calculations of how much grain to buy, in the knowing glance between neighbors when clouds gathered too dark over the fields. The younger generation, who had been children during the hunger, came of age with a mixture of resilience and caution. Many had taken on adult responsibilities early, tending animals, planting crops, helping to care for younger siblings when parents were too weak or ill. This early maturity often made them resourceful and self-reliant, but also wary of waste. A loaf of bread was never treated carelessly. A pail of milk was watched over as though it were gold. In these habits, the famine lived on more vividly than in any written record. Cultural traditions adapted as well. Stories told by the hearth now included not only ancient legends but also tales of the recent famine, recounted in ways that mixed history and moral lesson. In one village, an annual day of fasting was kept in remembrance of the dead, followed by a shared feast to celebrate survival. In another, the first sheaf of grain from each harvest was still offered at the church altar, a ritual blending pagan echoes with Christian devotion. These customs helped anchor the memory of hardship in a way that bound the living to the lessons of the past. On the land itself, the famine's imprint was visible in how people farmed. Marginal fields, once pushed to yield beyond their capacity, were sometimes left fallow or turned over to pasture, allowing the soil to recover. Farmers became more attentive to the signs of weather and soil health, watching the skies with the practiced eyes of those who knew that a few weeks of ill-timed rain or sun could tip the balance from plenty to hunger. Simple innovations, better drainage ditches, sturdier grain stores, shared milling equipment, spread more quickly, for people now valued anything that might improve their odds in the face of nature's uncertainty. Political authority, too, felt the impact of the famine. Lords who had been generous in distributing grain or forgiving rents found their reputations strengthened, and their subjects more loyal. Those who had been harsh or indifferent often discovered that their influence had waned, sometimes to the point where communities resisted their demands. In rare cases, landholders who had abandoned their tenants during the crisis never returned, their estates passing into new hands through sale, seizure, or inheritance. The famine had tested the bonds of obligation, and not all had survived intact. Yet there was also a quiet strengthening of communal ties. Mutual aid societies, informal though they might be, began to take root in some areas. Neighbors agreed to share certain tools, to help each other at harvest, or to contribute small amounts of grain to a common storehouse. Such arrangements were not always smooth. Disputes over fairness and effort were inevitable, but they reflected a hard-learned truth. Isolation was dangerous, and cooperation could be the difference between survival and ruin. In the broader realm, chroniclers and clerics wrote of the famine with a mix of sorrow and warning, framing it as both divine chastisement and human failure. Some saw it as a call to greater piety and moral reform. Others pointed to the need for better stewardship of land and resources. While these writings reached only a small literate portion of the population, their sentiments filtered down through sermons and public readings, shaping the collective understanding of what had happened and why. Through all this, life continued. Children were born who would never know the hunger their parents endured. Fields once abandoned were green again, dotted with workers bent to their tasks. In the evenings, the glow of hearth fires could be seen through cottage windows, the smell of bread and stew drifting into the cool night air. Yet beneath this renewed life lay a shared resolve, unspoken but deeply felt, to never again be caught so unprepared, to carry forward the memory of loss as a shield against the future. In the years that followed, the slow work of rebuilding moved forward with a rhythm both deliberate and fragile. Families measured time not by grand events, but by the steady passing of seasons, each harvest a milestone of reassurance. Grain stores, once painfully empty, began to swell again, though few allowed themselves the luxury of using them without caution. Even in times of plenty, there was always a part of the mind that counted the sacks in the loft, the barrels in the cellar, and thought of what might come if the weather turned or pests struck. Markets grew livelier, not only with food but with goods that had vanished during the famine years. Cloth of better quality, metal tools forged with care, small luxuries like honey or dried fruit from distant lands. Artisans who had barely survived found new customers eager to repair homes, mend clothing, or commission carved chests for the storage of precious grain. Every trade, from the potter to the blacksmith, felt the lift of renewed stability, though none forgot how quickly fortune could turn. Travel between towns increased, bringing with it not only goods but news and ideas. Minstrels carried songs that spoke of resilience and recovery, mixing tales of saints with stories of common folk who had endured and prevailed. Pilgrims set out again for distant shrines, seeking both spiritual comfort and the blessings of divine protection against future hardship. These journeys became more than religious acts. They were living bridges between communities, weaving together the shared memory of survival across regions. For many, the famine had reshaped their sense of property and belonging. The land itself seemed almost animate, capable of betrayal as well as bounty. Some chose to diversify, keeping not only grain but also hardy root vegetables, legumes, and herbs that could better withstand poor conditions. Orchards were tended with renewed care, and beekeeping became more common in areas where flowers grew thick in the spring. People learned to look at the landscape not simply as a backdrop to their labor, but as a partner whose needs and moods had to be understood. Religious observance deepened in certain places, while in others, quiet skepticism grew. Priests who had worked tirelessly to feed their parishioners found their flocks more devoted than ever. Those who had been absent or hoarded resources saw pews empty and offerings dwindle. In some villages, lay-led gatherings became common, small groups meeting in homes to pray, share food, and speak frankly about what had been endured. Faith remained, but it had been tempered by experience. People expected more tangible compassion from their spiritual leaders. Young adults, many of whom had been children in the worst years, carried an air of determination. They worked harder than their parents had at the same age, perhaps because they had seen too clearly what happened when reserves ran out. Marriage patterns shifted. People wed a little later, often waiting until they had secure land or a trade to rely on. A few were reluctant to bring children into a world that could turn so cruel, though most eventually yielded to the rhythms of family life, confident in their own ability to prepare and protect. Communal gatherings reflected the new era of caution mixed with hope. Festivals returned, but they often included elements of remembrance, a candlelit procession for the dead, a prayer before the feast to honor survival. Storytellers wove the famine into local folklore, creating heroes out of those who had shared their last crust of bread or discovered an unexpected food source that saved lives. These narratives gave meaning to suffering and offered a blueprint for how to act if such times came again. Trade relationships between regions shifted as well. Towns that had once depended heavily on a single supplier now sought multiple sources for key goods. Merchants learned to diversify their routes, carrying not only luxury items but staples, ensuring that they could sell something even in leaner years. This network of exchange was a kind of insurance, reducing the likelihood that one bad harvest in a single area would lead to total collapse. Despite the progress, there were still moments when old fears rose up. A sudden cold snap in late spring could silence a village, eyes turning skyward as if willing the sun to return. A swarm of locusts on the horizon could send people running to gather what they could before the pests descended. These moments revealed how thin the line between security and vulnerability remained. Yet now there was a difference. People had strategies, stored food, shared knowledge. They were not helpless as they had once been. In the quiet hours of the evening, when work was done and fires burned low, families spoke of the future with a guarded kind of optimism. There was no promise that the world would be kind, but there was confidence in their own capacity to endure. Children drifted to sleep listening to stories that began in hunger but ended in renewal, learning from their earliest days that survival was not only a matter of luck, but of preparation, unity, and the will to keep going when the odds were against them. As the years passed, the famine receded into memory, but it never truly vanished from the minds of those who had lived through it. For the older generation, it became a point of reference for every decision: when to plant, how much to store, when to trade, and when to refuse a risky venture. For the younger ones, who had only faint memories of empty tables and hollow faces, it became a story told by parents and elders, part warning, part testament to resilience. These stories were repeated at winter gatherings, often beginning with the same words. In the year the fields went barren. The telling was both a ritual and a lesson, ensuring that no one grew careless in good times. The countryside bore subtle marks of the crisis long after recovery. Extra granaries stood alongside older barns, some built collectively by villages rather than by individual households. Communal fields, once rare, became more common in certain areas, a hedge against future scarcity. Shared livestock herds grazed in rotation across pastures, their upkeep funded jointly by the community. These arrangements were not born of idealism, but of the hard reality that collective security was stronger than individual plenty when disaster struck. In architecture, the famine left its own imprint. Homes built after those years often included larger cellars or lofts designed for long-term storage. Thick stone walls insulated food supplies from heat and pests, while ventilation slits allowed airflow to keep grain dry. In regions where winters were harsh, smokehouses multiplied, allowing meat to be preserved for months. These innovations were not simply conveniences. They were survival measures, quietly shaping the landscape and daily routines of those who never wanted to face hunger again. Markets became more than economic centers. They were hubs of communication. Farmers, traders, and craftsmen exchanged not only goods but also observations on weather, crop conditions, and rumors of shortages in other towns. A poor harvest in one region might spark early preparation elsewhere, as people learned to read the warning signs hidden in the chatter of market day. Even gossip took on a strategic value. Its flow is essential to survival as the movement of grain carts along the road. In some places, charitable traditions grew from the memory of shared suffering. Wealthier families, mindful of how quickly fortune could fade, quietly set aside a portion of their stores each year for those less fortunate. Churches organized winter chests filled with food, blankets, and tools, ready to be distributed in emergencies. These acts were not framed as generosity so much as duty, a recognition that in the famine years, survival had often depended on the unexpected kindness of others. The arts reflected the change as well. Frescoes and tapestries began to depict scenes of abundance alongside images of want, illustrating the cycle of fortune and the moral duty of sharing. Songs were written that praised the virtues of thrift, foresight, and cooperation, often with refrains easy for children to remember. Folk tales that once centered on brave warriors or cunning tricksters now made room for humble farmers whose patience and preparation saved entire villages. Even in entertainment, the lessons of the famine were woven into the culture. Over time, a quiet confidence returned, though it was of a different kind than before. People no longer believed in unbroken prosperity. Instead, they believed in their ability to adapt. A dry summer or a wet autumn no longer provoked immediate panic, because plans were in place, supplies secured, and mutual aid agreements honored. This did not erase hardship. Lean years still came, but it meant that hardship was no longer the same as disaster. The psychological shadow of the famine lingered most visibly in the way people treated waste. Scraps of cloth were mended into new garments, broken tools repaired rather than discarded, and even the smallest crumbs of bread were saved for animals or soup. Children were gently scolded if they left food uneaten, reminded that nothing is too small to matter. These habits, passed down with deliberate care, became part of the culture's moral fabric. As decades rolled on, the famine moved from living memory to history, but its influence endured in subtle, pervasive ways. It shaped trade patterns, agricultural methods, architecture, and even the values by which people judge themselves and their neighbors. In moments of uncertainty, whether caused by poor weather, political unrest, or rumors of war, villages instinctively fell back on the structures built in those years. Shared storage, diversified crops, and the knowledge that survival was a collective endeavor. And so, the famine that had once seemed poised to end whole communities instead became the forge in which their resilience was tempered. From it came a culture that valued foresight as much as courage, cooperation as much as strength, and preparation as much as hope. The land, once a source of betrayal, was treated with a new respect, and each harvest was accepted not as an entitlement, but as a gift that might one day be withheld. In the hearts of those who had known hunger, this understanding was not a burden but a source of quiet strength. For they had learned the hardest truth, that endurance is not only about surviving the worst, but about living wisely in the best of times, so that when the wheel of fortune turns, you are ready to meet it. Looking back over the long arc of those years, it becomes clear that the famine's greatest legacy was not the suffering it caused, but the transformation it inspired. Hardship had carved deep lines into the lives of an entire generation, but it also bound them together in ways that prosperity alone never could. People learned to see their fortunes not as isolated possessions, but as part of a web that stretched across fields, families, and towns. The understanding that one person's abundance could be another's survival reshaped the very rhythm of daily life. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was the recognition that strength lay in interdependence. In time, the famine became more than an event. It became a touchstone of identity. Parents told their children not only about the hunger, but about the decisions that had made the difference between life and death, the grain hidden away for a neighbor, the shared labor that saved a crop, the hard choices made to preserve seed for the next season. These stories, repeated year after year, kept alive a sense of humility and preparedness. Even in good harvests, no one assumed the next would be as generous. The land itself bore witness to the change. Fields were tended with greater care. Soil managed to hold fertility, and planting cycles adapted to balance risk. The people had learned that the earth's bounty was never guaranteed, and that respect for its limits was as vital as skill in coaxing it to produce. In the end, the famine did not define them solely by their suffering, but by the way they rebuilt patiently, wisely, and together. That resilience became the true inheritance, carried quietly into the future like a seed kept safe through the longest winter, waiting for the right season to grow.